You need to move to the back of the plane now. This business class seat isn't meant for you." The words sliced through the cabin air, sharp and deliberate. Flight attendant Thomas Bennett stood in the aisle, his posture rigid, his expression a practiced mask of professional authority as he loomed over Dominique Reynolds' shoulder. Dominique looked up from her book, momentarily puzzled. She glanced at her boarding pass again, seat 4C business class, North Star Airways flight 1942 to Chicago. Everything was in order. "There must be some mistake," she replied evenly. "I have a confirmed business class reservation." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The computer shows otherwise. We need this seat for a priority passenger. You'll need to gather your things immediately." Around them, the business cabin had fallen silent. A dozen pairs of eyes, mostly belonging to white men in expensive suits, watched with a mix of discomfort and detachment. One woman across the aisle pretended to search through her purse, avoiding the scene entirely. "I paid for this seat," Dominique said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to see this alleged computer error." "Ma'am," Thomas replied, his voice louder now, ensuring everyone could hear. "We can discuss the details after you move. We have a full flight and need to complete boarding." As if on cue, Laura Wilson, the head flight attendant, appeared at Thomas's side. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though her eyes made clear she already knew the answer. "This passenger needs to be reseated in the main cabin," Thomas explained. "Last row." Dominique felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. The screen lit up with a name that made her pause, Secretary of Transportation. She looked back up at the two flight attendants, now blocking the aisle, their expressions expectant, waiting for her compliance. "Very well," she said quietly, gathering her belongings. "I'll move. For now." Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story of power, prejudice, and justice at 30,000 feet, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever witnessed discrimination in public spaces, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community, dedicated to exposing injustice and celebrating dignity. Now let's return to North Star Airways Flight 1842, where Dominique Reynolds is about to teach everyone on board an unforgettable lesson in respect. Dominique Reynolds stood in her Georgetown brownstone that morning, sipping coffee as she watched the early news. Outside her window, Washington, D.C. was just beginning to stir, the September sun casting long shadows across her tree-lined street. At 54, Dominique carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had broken barriers her entire life. Silver streaks wove elegantly through her natural hair, which she wore in a sophisticated twist that framed her face, a face that had recently become more recognizable thanks to her historic appointment. And in transportation news, the CNN anchor announced, Dominique Reynolds begins her third month as the first black female director of the Federal Aviation Administration. Reynolds, who holds a Ph.D. in aerospace engineering from MIT and served 27 years in aviation safety oversight, faces immediate challenges as major airlines push back against her proposed new safety regulations. Dominique muted the television with a small smile. The media coverage still felt surreal, though she'd earned every step of her journey. From her first position as a junior safety inspector to her appointment as FAA director by the president himself, she had navigated the overwhelmingly white and male aviation industry with strategic brilliance and unwavering integrity. On her dining room table lay the materials for today's crucial meeting in Chicago. Comprehensive data supporting her proposed nationwide safety protocols that would prevent an estimated 300 potential incidents annually. The Reynolds reforms, as industry insiders had dubbed them, represented the most significant safety overhaul in decades. They also required substantial investment from airlines already complaining about thin profit margins. North Star Airways had emerged as the most vocal opponent, with CEO William Parker personally lobbying against the changes. His company, the third largest carrier in the United States, stood to spend an estimated $240 million implementing the new systems. Parker had made his opposition clear in congressional testimony, industry conferences, and increasingly through personal attacks questioning Dominique's qualifications. As she organized her presentation materials, Dominique reviewed her arguments methodically. The cost analyses proved the investments would actually save money long term. The safety data was irrefutable. The technological improvements were feasible within the proposed timeline. She had anticipated and prepared for every counter-argument. What she couldn't prepare for was the personal dimension of the resistance, the subtle and not-so-subtle implications that her policies stemmed from inexperience or political pressure rather than expertise. Those criticisms never directly mentioned her race or gender, but the subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. Dominique zipped her leather portfolio closed and glanced at the framed photograph on her mantel herself at the White House ceremony, right hand raised, as she took the oath of office. It had been a momentous day, not just for her, but for countless young women of color who might now see aviation leadership as a possibility. With her testimony prepared and her arguments solid, Dominique made a last-minute decision. Rather than having her assistant Daniel book her usual FAA travel arrangements complete with the security detail and VIP treatment that had become standard since her appointment, she would make this trip personally. Book her own flight. Fly like a regular passenger. Sometimes you need to see the system as users experience it, she murmured to herself, opening her laptop and navigating to the North Star Airways website. She selected Flight 1E42, departing Reagan National at 9:45 a.m., arriving O'Hare at 11:07 a.m. Plenty of time before her 2:00 p.m. meeting. Using her personal frequent flyer account, she applied an upgrade to business class. She'd earned Platinum Elite status over years of constant travel, and the upgrade cleared immediately. Confirmation screen showed seat 4C. Dominique opted for comfortable travel attire rather than her usual formal suits, tailored black slacks, a deep purple cashmere sweater, and simple gold earrings. Professional enough for unexpected encounters, but comfortable for travel. Her formal clothes for the meeting went into her garment bag. Her FAA credentials went into her purse more out of habit than expectation she'd need them. As she called for her rideshare, she texted Daniel, taking a personal day before Chicago meeting. "We'll meet you at Palmer House at 1:30. Daniel's response came quickly. "Everything okay? Security team is confused about transport." "All fine," she replied. "Just need some normal travel time. See you there." Little did she know how abnormal this journey would become. The phone rang as Dominique was double-checking her briefcase contents. The screen showed Richard Coleman, her mentor, and the former FAA director who had championed her appointment. "You ready for the Lion's Den tomorrow?" Richard's deep voice carried the weight of experience when she answered. "As ready as I'll ever be," Dominique replied, tucking a folder of financial projections into her briefcase. "North Star has been the most vocal opponent. Their CEO will be there. William Parker," Richard said with undisguised contempt. That man would cut corners on a circle if it saved him $1. He paused before continuing, his tone more serious. "Listen, Dominique, I need to warn you. Parker didn't just oppose your safety protocols. He opposed your appointment." Dominique paused, her hand hovering over a stack of regulatory documents. "Because I'm too strict on safety requirements. Because you're a black woman with power," Richard said bluntly. "He's from the old school. Doesn't think you belong at the table, let alone at its head." She sighed, unsurprised. Wouldn't be the first time. Her mind drifted to her father, Colonel Joseph Reynolds, one of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. His photograph sat on her dresser, a handsome young man in uniform, standing proudly beside his P-51 Mustang fighter plane. He had flown 65 combat missions during World War II, receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross and Purple Heart, only to return home to an America that wouldn't let him fly commercial aircraft because of his skin color. "They couldn't stop me from flying," he had told her when she was just 8 years old, sitting on his lap as he showed her how to fold a paper airplane. So I built my own path. And someday, baby girl, you'll build yours. His words had kindled her lifelong passion for aviation, though she'd chosen the regulatory path rather than becoming a pilot herself. I want to make sure everyone can fly safely, she had told him when she graduated from Stanford with her aerospace engineering degree. He'd smiled, then pride shining in his eyes. Colonel Reynolds had lived long enough to see his daughter's early career successes, but had passed away 5 years before her FAA appointment. At his Arlington National Cemetery funeral, 3 vintage P-51 Mustangs had performed a missing man formation flyover arranged by pilots who understood his legacy. He would have loved seeing you take the oath, Richard said, somehow sensing where her thoughts had gone. He laid the groundwork for this moment. I carry him with me to every meeting, Dominique acknowledged, especially the difficult ones. Her phone beeped with another incoming call. I should take this, Richard. It's Amara. Give my best to that brilliant daughter of yours. And Dominique, don't let Parker intimidate you tomorrow. You've got the facts on your side. She smiled. I've never been easily intimidated. Switching calls, she heard her daughter's voice. Mom, just wanted to wish you good luck with the meeting tomorrow. You're going to crush it. Thanks, sweetheart. Dominique smiled. How's the research going for your paper on transportation discrimination cases? Slow, Amara admitted. There's so much history to wade through and most of it makes me angry. Amara's voice carried the passionate intensity that reminded Dominique of herself at that age. At 23, Amara was following her own path as a second-year law student at Howard University, focusing on civil rights law with a special interest in transportation equity cases. Channel that anger into change, just like we talked about, Dominique advised. I know, Mom. That's why I'm so proud of what you're doing, the first black woman to run the FAA, creating safety regulations that will protect everyone equally. You're making history. Dominique hesitated before asking, would you like to help with the research on this? I could use someone with your perspective looking at the historical patterns. Amara's voice brightened immediately. Really? For the official investigation? As an intern, yes. You'd be reviewing passenger complaint data looking for patterns. It would be valuable for both your paper and our work. I'm in, Amara replied without hesitation. I'll start organizing a team of law students to help. We can create a database of discrimination cases in aviation going back decades. Dominique smiled at her daughter's immediate action orientation. That would be incredibly helpful. We'll talk more when I get back from Chicago. After ending the call, Dominique stood before her dresser looking at her father's photograph. She gently touched the glass covering his image. Another big day, Dad, she whispered. Wish you were here to see it. As she turned to leave, she noticed the small wooden box beside the photo containing her father's distinguished flying cross. On impulse, she opened it, removed the medal, and slipped it into her pocket. A talisman of sorts carrying his courage with her. She had no way of knowing just how much courage she would need before this day was done. Reagan National Airport hummed with its usual morning energy as Dominique joined the security line. She had deliberately arrived without the typical trappings of her position. No security detail, no escort to bypass lines, no visible indicators of her FAA role. Today, she was simply another traveler observing the system as most people experienced it. The subtle microaggressions began almost immediately. The TSA officer scrutinized her government ID longer than necessary, glancing repeatedly between her face and the photo. "This is you," he questioned, though the resemblance was unmistakable. "Yes, it is," she replied calmly, accustomed to such interactions. She noticed the white businessman behind her receiving barely a glance at his credentials before being waved through. At the scanner, Dominique placed her laptop and personal items in the bin, following standard procedures she had helped develop. Yet somehow the same businessman who had placed his items on the conveyor belt after hers was flagged to proceed first. When she reached to collect her belongings on the other side, another TSA agent stopped her. "Is this your laptop, ma'am?" he questioned, despite having watched her place it in the bin. "Yes, it is," she repeated, maintaining her composure. The cumulative effect of these small interactions, each defensible in isolation, damning in pattern, was familiar to her. They were the very reason she occasionally traveled this way, experiencing the aviation system without the buffer of her title. What she observed always informed her work, reinforcing her commitment to creating more equitable standards. As Dominique walked toward her gate, a small knot of doubt formed in her stomach, something she rarely allowed herself to feel in professional settings. Was she making the right decision to fly incognito today? With Parker's opposition to her reforms growing more personal, was she putting herself at unnecessary risk? "This is exactly why I need to do this," she thought, pushing the doubt aside. "If I start avoiding situations because of potential discrimination, I'm part of the problem." Still, she touched the metal in her pocket for reassurance, feeling a connection to her father's courage that transcended time and circumstance. Dominique checked her watch as she approached the gate for North Star Airways Flight 1842. Boarding would begin in approximately 15 minutes. She found a seat near the gate, took out her phone, and quickly reviewed her presentation materials one final time. The gate area filled with the typical mix of business and leisure travelers. North Star's signature blue uniforms moved efficiently among the crowd, gate agents preparing for boarding, flight attendants arriving for their assignments. Dominique observed them with professional interest, noting their procedures and interactions. "Pre-boarding will begin shortly for our Platinum Elite members and passengers requiring special assistance," announced the gate agent. "North Star Airways welcomes you to Flight 1942 with service to Chicago O'Hare." Dominique gathered her belongings, boarding pass in hand. As a Platinum Elite member using her personal frequent flyer account, she qualified for the first general boarding group after pre-boarding. She stood joining the small gathering of mostly business travelers near the gate. Now, welcoming our Platinum Elite members to board through Lane 1 came the announcement. Dominique stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass and ID. The gate agent scanned her ticket, barely glancing at her face. "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Enjoy your flight." The jet bridge stretched before her as she rolled her carry-on toward the aircraft door. She could see the North Star logo on the plane's fuselage through the small windows. Flight 1942, a Boeing 737-800 that would carry her to Chicago, and her confrontation with William Parker. Little did she know that the confrontation would begin much sooner, and in a way she never anticipated. As she approached the aircraft door, she saw the flight attendants greeting passengers. The lead flight attendant, a blonde woman with a tight smile, stood at the entrance. Her name tag read Laura Wilson. Beside her, a younger male flight attendant, whose tag identified him as Thomas Bennett, directed passengers. "Good morning," Dominique offered politely as she reached the doorway. Laura's eyes performed a quick assessment, her smile remaining fixed but cooling noticeably. "Seat," she asked, curtly skipping the warm welcome Dominique had observed her offering to the white businessman ahead of her. 4C. Dominique replied, showing her boarding pass. Laura gave a stiff nod, already looking past her to the next passenger. "Left side near the front." Dominique navigated to her row where a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit occupied the window seat. His monogrammed briefcase displayed the initials R.T. Robert Thompson, according to the subtle embroidery on his shirt cuff. He was typing furiously on his laptop, barely acknowledging her presence. "Excuse me?" she said politely, indicating she needed to access the aisle seat. Thompson's eyes flicked up, registering surprise, then immediate discomfort. He adjusted his position minimally, forcing Dominique to squeeze past. As she settled in, he subtly shifted toward the window, creating maximum distance between them. Dominique observed the business cabin filling quickly with predominantly white male executives, many receiving warm, personalized greetings from the crew. "Mr. Anderson, lovely to have you aboard again." "Mr. Goldstein," Your usual scotch once we're airborne." Meanwhile, Thomas Bennett passed her twice without acknowledgement. From her seat, Dominique could hear whispered conversation between Laura and Thomas near the galley. "We're overbooked in business again," Laura muttered. "Parker's going to have our heads if we keep upgrading the wrong people." "I know," Thomas replied. "The computer's supposed to prioritize our high-value customers, not." His eyes darted briefly toward Dominique before he caught himself. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly as the final business-class passengers boarded. Dominique opened her book, seemingly absorbed in reading while actually observing the dynamics around her. She couldn't have known that her observatory role was about to change dramatically. "We have a situation in 4C," Thomas whispered to Laura as they huddled in the forward galley. The business-class cabin was nearly full now, with only a few passengers still finding their seats. Laura glanced over Thomas's shoulder toward where Dominique sat calmly reading her book. "What kind of situation?" she asked, her voice low. "Platinum upgrade," Thomas said, emphasis on the first word. "But she doesn't fit the profile. Someone made a mistake." Laura's lips tightened. "We're already overbooked. Parker's been clear about maintaining the right cabin environment." "Rodriguez is working the main cabin," Thomas said, referring to their colleague. "She can handle the reassignment." Laura nodded sharply. "Do it quietly. We don't need a scene." Across the aisle from Dominique, a woman in her late 30s settled into her seat, arranging her belongings efficiently. Her tailored suit and confident demeanor marked her as a business traveler, though her warm smile as she greeted Dominique contrasted with Robert Thompson's continued chilly silence. "First time on North Star," the woman asked, extending her hand. "Angela Barnes." "Dominique Reynolds," she replied, shaking the offered hand. "And no, I've flown with them many times." "Interesting," Angela said. "I'm Sapphire Elite with them, fly this route twice monthly, and I've never seen such a full business cabin." Thompson made a small noise of disapproval at the conversation occurring across the aisle from him, shifting further toward his window. Dominique noticed but chose not to react. "Do you work in Chicago?" Angela continued, seemingly oblivious to Thompson's discomfort. "I'm based in D.C., but I have meetings in Chicago regularly," Dominique explained deliberately, keeping details vague. "You?" Corporate attorney Angela replied. "My firm has offices in both cities. I split my time." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas Bennett's return. He stopped at their row, focusing exclusively on Dominique while ignoring Angela entirely. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, voice professionally modulated, but with an undercurrent of authority. "There seems to be a situation with your reservation." Dominique looked up, expression neutral. "What situation would that be?" "My upgrade cleared automatically." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, that's actually the problem. There was a computer error with the upgrade system. This seat should have been allocated to one of our priority passengers." "Priority passengers," Dominique repeated, her tone measured. "Yes. We have certain allocation requirements for our highest-tier frequent flyers." Thomas explained, the explanation practiced and smooth. "Your upgrade should not have cleared automatically." 2 rows ahead, a young Hispanic man had begun discreetly recording the interaction on his phone, his expression concerned as he watched the scene unfold. "I'm a Platinum Elite member," Dominique stated calmly. "I've held that status for 9 years. The upgrade cleared according to your published policies." Thomas's expression hardened slightly. "There are additional factors in the allocation algorithm. I'll need you to gather your belongings and move to your reassigned seat." "And where would that be?" Dominique asked. "We've found space in the main cabin," Thomas replied. "Near the rear of the aircraft." Angela Barnes had stopped arranging her things and was now watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Excuse me," she interrupted. "I've never heard of retroactively canceling a confirmed upgrade. Is that official North Star policy?" Thomas's attention remained fixed on Dominique, ignoring Angela's question entirely. We need to complete boarding, Ms. Reynolds. Please gather your belongings. Robert Thompson made a show of checking his watch impatiently. Some of us have important meetings to get to, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The Hispanic man recording had been joined by an elderly white woman who had boarded late. She stood in the aisle observing the situation with clear disapproval. "Young man," she said, addressing Thomas, "I've been flying since before you were born, and I've never seen an airline remove someone from a confirmed seat unless the flight was oversold, which clearly isn't the case here." "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," Thomas replied stiffly. "It absolutely concerns me," the woman retorted. "I'm Eleanor Foster, and I've been a North Star customer for 30 years. This treatment is appalling." Laura Wilson appeared at Thomas's side, her expression professionally concerned. "Is there a problem here? We need to complete boarding. Your colleague is attempting to remove me from my confirmed seat," Dominique explained calmly. "I'd like an explanation beyond computer error." Laura's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ms. Reynolds, we have discretion over seat assignments for operational reasons. We've made a determination that you need to be reseated. Now we can do this cooperatively, or we can involve the captain and ground staff, which would delay our departure." The implied threat hung in the air. Around them, other business-class passengers were now openly watching the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, others merely curious, while a few nodded in apparent agreement with the crew's position. The man recording the incident spoke up. "I'm Gabriel Morales, travel journalist. I'd like to understand the operational reason for removing this passenger from her confirmed seat." "For my readers." Laura's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing annoyance. "Sir, recording is permitted for personal use only, not for commercial purposes. I must ask you to stop." "Actually," Gabriel replied, "North Star's own policy permits recording as long as it doesn't interfere with crew duties." "I'm not interfering, just documenting." Dominique remained seated, hands folded calmly in her lap. "I'd like to speak with the captain," she said quietly. "The captain is preparing for departure," Laura replied quickly. "Ms. Reynolds, you're delaying an entire aircraft full of passengers. Please cooperate and move to your reassigned seat." Angela Barnes stood suddenly. "I'll switch seats with her," she offered. "Problem solved." "That's not possible," Laura said firmly. "Seat assignments have been finalized." The tension in the cabin had become palpable. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The confrontation had evolved from a private matter to a public spectacle, with Dominique at its center, maintaining her composure even as the pressure mounted. Inwardly, Dominique felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced throughout her career when facing discrimination. But along with it came something else, a growing realization that this moment, however uncomfortable, might serve a greater purpose. She touched her father's medal in her pocket, drawing strength from his legacy. "Is this how North Star typically treats its platinum elite passengers?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by surrounding rows. "Or is there something specific about me that warrants special treatment?" The question hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone watching. Thomas and Laura exchanged glances, neither wanting to address the underlying accusation. 3 hours earlier, before passengers had even arrived at the airport, the North Star crew had gathered for their pre-flight briefing in a small conference room at Reagan National. Captain Andrew Peterson, a 28-year veteran with military straight posture and prematurely white hair, reviewed the flight plan, while his first officer, James Wilson, checked weather conditions along their route. "Chicago's showing some potential turbulence on approach," James noted. "Nothing significant." "Noted," Peterson replied. "Let's plan for a smooth service regardless. Passenger manifest shows a nearly full flight with business class at capacity." Laura Wilson, serving as lead flight attendant, reviewed her tablet. "Actually, we're showing one open seat in business now. Last-minute cancellation." "Perfect," Peterson nodded. "That gives us flexibility if we need to accommodate a VIP." Thomas Bennett, scrolling through his own device, frowned. It's already been filled. Automatic upgrade from the queue. Who Laura asked. Thomas tapped the screen. Passenger Reynolds Dominique. Platinum status, but not on the priority list. The unspoken understanding passed between them. North Star Airways operated with an unofficial passenger priority system that categorized travelers beyond their published loyalty tiers. While never explicitly documented in public materials, the system was well understood by senior crew members. Let me see, Laura said, taking Thomas's tablet and reviewing the passenger information. Her expression tightened. African-American woman, personal account, not corporate. Definitely not on Parker's preferred list. Captain Peterson sighed. This again. You know Parker's position on business cabin demographics. The youngest flight attendant present, Sophia Rodriguez, shifted uncomfortably. I don't understand. If she has platinum status and the upgrade cleared automatically, what's the issue? Laura gave Sophia a look that suggested she'd spoken out of turn. The issue, Rodriguez, is that we have strict guidance about maintaining a certain atmosphere in the premium cabins. It comes directly from executive leadership. But that's, Sophia began, then stopped herself. That's what Thomas challenged. Company policy. Because it is. Maybe not written down, but made very clear in our premium service training. It doesn't feel right, Sophia said quietly. Captain Peterson interjected. We all have jobs to do. North Star has built its business model on catering to a specific clientele. High-value corporate travelers expect a certain experience. That's not politics, it's business. Laura nodded firmly. Exactly. And William Parker made it explicitly clear during last month's senior staff meeting that he wants business class passenger composition properly managed. His words, not mine. So, what's the plan? Thomas asked. Downgrade on boarding. Let me check something first, Laura said, typing quickly on the tablet. Interesting. Her reservation was self-made, not booked through a corporate travel office. Personal credit card. That makes it easier. Easier, how Sophia asked. We cite a verification issue with the upgrade, Laura explained. Say the system flagged it for review. We've done it before. Sophia looked increasingly uncomfortable but remained silent. Rodriguez Laura said sharply, You'll handle the reassignment. Last row of economy has a middle seat open. Tell her there's a status mismatch and the upgrade couldn't be verified. Why the last row? Sophia questioned, unable to hide her disapproval. Because that's what's available, Laura replied tersely, though everyone present knew that wasn't true. And because passengers who make a fuss need to understand there are consequences. Captain Peterson closed his flight plan. Let's keep this professional. No need for unnecessary conflict. Rodriguez, if you're not comfortable with standard North Star procedures, perhaps you should reconsider your position with the airline. The implied threat silenced Sophia's objections. One more thing, Laura added. Parker himself will be on the Chicago-Seattle leg this afternoon. Some of us will be continuing on that flight. He often checks the passenger manifests, especially in premium cabins. I don't want to have to explain why we didn't follow protocol. As the briefing concluded, Sophia lingered behind, watching her colleagues exit the room. She took out her phone, hesitated, then put it away without taking any action. The conflict between her personal ethics and professional requirements was visible on her face, but ultimately she followed the others toward the gate. None of them could have anticipated that their routine enforcement of North Star's unwritten policies would soon become front-page news, or that the passenger they planned to displace would be far more than she appeared. Meanwhile, in the exclusive Admiral Club lounge, William Parker himself was finishing a conference call with his executive team. The North Star CEO had unexpectedly decided to fly to Chicago personally for tomorrow's FAA meeting rather than joining remotely as originally planned. I want to look Reynolds in the eye when I challenge these regulations, he explained to his chief operations officer. She needs to understand who she's dealing with. Sir, our PR team suggests a more collaborative approach, his communications director cautioned. The optics of direct confrontation. I didn't build this airline by worrying about optics, Parker interrupted. Reynolds is using her position to push an agenda that would cost us nearly $250 million. The board expects me to fight this with everything we've got. What Parker didn't share was the memo he'd received from a congressional ally on the Transportation Committee suggesting that Reynolds' appointment was politically motivated rather than merit-based. He'd been quietly gathering opposition research for months looking for any vulnerability that might undermine her credibility. I'll be taking the Seattle connection after the meeting, Parker continued. Make sure everything is arranged to our standards. I don't want any surprises. Little did he know that Flight 1342 was about to deliver the biggest surprise of his career. Final boarding call for North Star Airlines Flight 1842 to Chicago O'Hare announced the gate agent's voice over the PA system. The business cabin was now completely full, with the final economy passengers making their way down the aisle toward the rear of the aircraft. Thomas Bennett returned to Dominique's row, this time accompanied not just by Laura Wilson, but also by a young Hispanic woman whose name tag identified her as Sophia Rodriguez. Ms. Reynolds Thomas began, his tone now firmer. We need to resolve this situation before departure. I've consulted with our ground team, and there's a clear status verification issue with your upgrade. What specific verification issue? Dominique asked, her voice calm but persistent. My status is Platinum Elite, which qualifies for the upgrade I received. My boarding pass is confirmed for this seat. Sophia Rodriguez looked visibly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as Laura nudged her forward slightly. Ms. Reynolds, Sophia began, her voice lacking the conviction of her colleagues. We've been asked to reseat you in the main cabin due to a status mismatch in our system. A status mismatch, Dominique repeated, not as a question, but as a statement. Could you explain exactly what that means? Before Sophia could respond, Laura interjected. It means the system flagged your account for manual verification, which couldn't be completed before boarding. As a result, the upgrade cannot be honored on this flight. Gabriel Morales, still recording discreetly, had been joined by several other passengers who were now openly watching the confrontation. Eleanor Foster, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier, had taken a seat across the aisle, her eyes sharp with disapproval. That's simply not how airline upgrades work, Dominique stated. Once confirmed and a boarding pass issued, the upgrade is contractually binding unless the flight is oversold or there's a legitimate equipment change. Thomas's professional demeanor began showing cracks. Ms. Reynolds, you're not an expert on airline policies. A slight knowing smile touched Dominique's lips, but vanished quickly. Actually, she began, then seemed to reconsider. Let me see the specific policy you're citing. Laura's expression tightened. We don't have to provide policy documentation during boarding. This is an operational decision. From the cockpit doorway, a new figure emerged. Captain Andrew Peterson surveyed the scene, his expression stern. What seems to be the problem here? We're scheduled for pushback in 7 minutes. Captain Laura said quickly, We have a passenger refusing to comply with a reseating request. I'm not refusing, Dominique clarified. I'm requesting documentation of the policy being applied and an explanation of the status mismatch they keep referring to. Peterson's gaze shifted to Dominique, taking in her appearance, her calm demeanor, and something else, an indefinable quality that gave him momentary pause. Ms. Reynolds, she supplied. Dominique Reynolds. Ms. Reynolds, he continued, as captain of this aircraft, I have final authority over all operational aspects of this flight. While I understand your frustration, I must ask you to comply with my crew's instructions. Eleanor Foster spoke up again. Captain, I've been observing this situation and something isn't right. I've flown over 2 million miles with North Star, and I've never seen a confirmed upgrade revoked during boarding without cause. Captain Peterson's attention remained fixed on Dominique. "Ma'am, we have 3 options here. You can accept the reseating, you can choose not to fly with us today and discuss the matter with customer service, or I can involve airport security, which would result in your removal from this flight entirely." The ultimatum hung in the air. The business cabin had fallen completely silent, with every passenger now watching the confrontation. In the galley, Sofia Rodriguez had stepped back, her discomfort with the situation increasingly evident. Dominique felt a moment of internal conflict. Her professional responsibility demanded she reach Chicago for the important meeting, yet her personal dignity and sense of justice pushed back against the discriminatory treatment. For the first time, she considered revealing her identity, but something held her back, the recognition that doing so would change the dynamic entirely and potentially obscure the underlying issues. She thought of her father, who had faced far worse discrimination with dignity and strategic patience. She thought of the countless travelers who experienced similar treatment without having the position or platform to challenge it effectively. And she made a decision. "I see," Dominique said quietly. She glanced at her watch, considering her options. She had an important meeting in Chicago that couldn't be rescheduled. Making a scene that resulted in her removal from the flight wasn't productive. "Very well," she said finally. "I will relocate as requested under protest, and with the understanding that this matter is far from resolved." A look of satisfaction crossed Laura's face. Thomas stepped aside, gesturing toward the back of the aircraft. "Ms. Rodriguez will show you to your new seat." As Dominique gathered her belongings, Angela Barnes leaned toward her. "This is wrong," she whispered. "I'm an attorney. You have grounds for a complaint." "I'm well aware," Dominique replied quietly, a hint of something in her voice that made Angela look at her more closely. Gabriel Morales continued recording as Dominique stood. "I'm documenting everything," he assured her. "This isn't right." Dominique nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you for your concern." As she stepped into the aisle, Eleanor Foster reached out briefly, touching her arm in silent solidarity. Robert Thompson, meanwhile, had already returned to his laptop, seemingly relieved that the disruption was ending. With Sophia leading the way, Dominique began the long walk from the front of the business cabin toward the rear of the aircraft. Dozens of eyes followed her progress, some curious, some indifferent, some openly disapproving of her treatment. What none of them yet realized was that this was not simply a case of airline policy enforcement. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would transform North Star Airways forever, starting with the woman they had just banished to the back of the plane. As Dominique walked, her thoughts swirled with conflicting emotions, anger at the injustice, determination to address it systematically, and a strange sense of purpose. Perhaps this experience, however humiliating, would provide the first-hand evidence needed to drive meaningful change in an industry where such practices had long been normalized. She touched her father's medal in her pocket again, drawing strength from his legacy of dignity in the face of discrimination. "I'll make this count, Dad," she thought, "for everyone who couldn't fight back." The walk to the rear of the aircraft felt interminable. Dominique maintained perfect posture, her expression neutral, despite the public humiliation being inflicted upon her. As she passed row after row of economy seats, whispers followed in her wake, passengers sensing that something unusual was happening. Sofia Rodriguez led the way, her discomfort evident in her rigid shoulders and averted gaze. When they finally reached the last row, row 38, directly in front of the lavatories, Sophia gestured to the middle seat. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and something in her tone suggested she truly was. "Don't apologize for a policy you didn't create." Dominique replied, her voice low enough that only Sophia could hear. "But remember that carrying out unjust directives is still a choice." Sophia's eyes widened slightly before she turned away, hurrying back toward the front of the plane. Dominique stored her carry-on in the overhead bin and took her assigned middle seat. To her left, next to the window, sat an elderly black woman with silver hair and dignified bearing. To her right, the aisle seat remained temporarily empty. "They got you too," I see, the woman said, her voice carrying the warm cadence of the American South. I'm Beatrice Johnson, Dominique Reynolds, she replied, extending her hand. And what do you mean, got me too? Beatrice's smile held decades of knowing. Child, I've been flying for 67 years, started back when they had separate waiting areas in airports. What just happened to you? She nodded toward the front of the plane. That's just the modern version of the same old story. You saw didn't need to. I recognized the walk. That dignified, I'm not giving them the satisfaction walk. Held my head high just like you when they wouldn't let me sit in first class back in 1962. Before Dominique could respond, a middle-aged white man arrived, gesturing to the aisle seat. Excuse me, ladies. They shifted to allow him access. Once settled, he introduced himself. Jeffrey Davis. Couldn't help noticing that little drama up front. Pretty shameful. You were watching, Dominique asked. Everyone was watching, he confirmed. Not the first time I've seen it on North Star either. They have a reputation. From several rows ahead, Gabriel Morales turned in his seat, catching Dominique's eye. He held up his phone briefly, a silent confirmation that he was still documenting the situation. Eleanor Foster appeared in the aisle beside their row. This is absurd, she announced loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. They have multiple open seats in economy, plus yet they sent you all the way back here. Ms. Foster, please return to your seat. Thomas Bennett called from midway down the aisle. We're preparing for departure. I will not, Eleanor declared. Not until you explain why this woman was singled out. Thomas strode purposefully toward them, his expression strained. Ma'am, as I've told you, this was an operational decision based on verification issues. What verification issues? Eleanor challenged. Be specific. Thomas lowered his voice. This is not a public discussion. Return to your seat, or I'll be forced to involve the captain again. The confrontation had drawn attention from throughout the cabin. Passengers were openly watching now, some recording with their phones. The atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. Dominique felt torn between her desire to let the situation unfold, revealing the discriminatory patterns at work, and her responsibility to ensure the flight proceeded safely. She was acutely aware that her dual roles as passenger and FAA director were creating an unprecedented ethical dilemma. It's all right, Ms. Foster, Dominique said calmly. Please return to your seat. This situation will be addressed, but not right now. Eleanor seemed reluctant, but eventually nodded. This isn't over, she told Thomas before making her way back toward the front. As the final preparations for takeoff continued, Sophia Rodriguez passed through the cabin, avoiding eye contact with Dominique. Laura Wilson made an appearance in economy, surveying the situation with evident satisfaction before returning to her position. Flight attendants prepare for departure, came Captain Peterson's voice over the PA system. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, the engines rumbling to life. As they taxied toward the runway, Dominique's phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at it discreetly. Secretary of Transportation flashed on the screen. Under normal circumstances, she would have powered off her device for takeoff, but these were not normal circumstances. She pressed the answer button. This is Reynolds, she said quietly. Thomas Bennett, making a final cabin check, spotted her immediately. Ma'am, all phones must be turned off for departure, he called, moving rapidly in her direction. I understand, but this is an emergency call, Dominique replied, still listening to the secretary. I don't care if it's the president. Thomas insisted, reaching her row. End the call now, or you'll be removed from this flight when we return to the gate. Dominique looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. Mr. Bennett, she said, her voice taking on a new authority. This call is from the Secretary of Transportation regarding an urgent aviation safety matter. I suggest you reconsider your tone. Thomas faltered, slightly confused by her sudden command presence. Who exactly do you think you are, Beatrice? Johnson chuckled softly beside her. Oh, son, she murmured. You're about to find out. Dominique spoke into the phone. Yes, Secretary Williams. I'm currently on North Star Flight 1842. There's a situation developing that requires my immediate attention. I'll need to speak with Captain Peterson. Thomas's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief. You expect me to believe you're on a call with the Transportation Secretary? Mr. Bennett? Dominique replied, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small leather folder. I am Director Dominique Reynolds of the Federal Aviation Administration. This is an urgent safety matter that requires immediate action. Please inform Captain Peterson that I need to speak with him before this aircraft takes off. The cabin fell silent as Thomas stared at the credentials being presented to him. His face drained of color. The FAA director, he stammered. Correct, Dominique confirmed. Now, shall we continue this discussion in the cockpit, or would you prefer to do it here in front of your passengers? The revelation landed like a thunderbolt, sending shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation erupted in astonished whispers. Several began recording more openly now, recognizing the historic nature of what was unfolding. For Dominique, the moment brought a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction at Thomas's stunned reaction, yet discomfort at being forced to use her position in this way. She had wanted to experience the system as an ordinary passenger, but the discrimination had made that impossible. I'll inform the captain immediately. Thomas managed his previously authoritative demeanor completely shattered. He hurried toward the cockpit, nearly colliding with other crew members in his haste. Dominique turned to Beatrice Johnson. I apologize for the disruption, Miss Johnson. This wasn't how I planned this flight to go. Beatrice's eyes twinkled with a mixture of wisdom and delight. Child, sometimes the plans we make aren't as important as the plans the universe has for us. I think you're exactly where you need to be right now. Jeffrey Davis leaned forward now, regarding Dominique with new understanding. Director Reynolds, if you need technical documentation about their systems, I'm an IT security consultant. I'd be happy to assist your investigation. Thank you, Mr. Davis, Dominique acknowledged. That offer may prove very valuable shortly. As the realization of who was seated in the last row spread throughout the aircraft, the power dynamic shifted dramatically. What had begun as an attempt to diminish one passenger had transformed into a moment of reckoning for an entire airline, one that would soon extend far beyond the confines of Flight 1842. The moments following Dominique's revelation seemed suspended in time. Thomas Bennett stood frozen in the aisle, his expression cycling through disbelief, realization, and finally unmistakable fear. Passengers in nearby rows who had overheard the exchange began whispering to each other, the news spreading through the cabin like wildfire. The FAA director. They put her in the last row. North Star is in trouble. Beatrice Johnson sat beside Dominique, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Well now, she said softly, this flight just got a whole lot more interesting. Jeffrey Davis in the aisle seat looked between Dominique and Thomas with barely concealed amazement. Director Reynolds, he said, I've read about your safety initiatives. It's an honor to meet you, though I wish under better circumstances. Thomas finally recovered enough to speak. I'll inform the captain immediately, he managed, backing away and nearly colliding with Sophia Rodriguez, who had approached to investigate the commotion. What's happening? Sophia asked, confusion evident on her face. Before Thomas could respond, Gabriel Morales called from several rows ahead. They downgraded the FAA director to the last row because of her race. His voice carried throughout the economy cabin, causing a fresh wave of murmurs and exclamations. That's not... I didn't... Thomas sputtered, looking desperately toward Sophia for support. We need to get the captain. Yes, Dominique agreed calmly. You do. But first, I'd like everyone to remain in their current seats. This aircraft isn't going anywhere until several matters are addressed. Thomas hurried toward the front, his normally confident stride reduced to something approaching flight. Sophia remained, uncertainty written across her features. Ms. Rodriguez Dominique said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I'd appreciate if you would stay here momentarily. I have some questions about North Star's seating policies." Sophia swallowed visibly. "Of course, Director Reynolds." Eleanor Foster had made her way back to the rear of the aircraft, defying instructions to remain seated. "I knew something wasn't right," she declared triumphantly. 30 years flying with North Star, and I've seen this pattern before, but never so blatantly. Ms. Foster Dominique acknowledged, "I appreciate your advocacy earlier. Would you mind telling me more about the patterns you've observed?" Eleanor nodded eagerly. "It's been happening for years, but subtly. I started noticing when I would fly with my former business partner, who is black. Despite us having identical status, he would consistently be passed over for upgrades or seated in less desirable locations. Several other passengers had turned in their seats, listening intently to the conversation. One woman, a few rows ahead, spoke up. "The same thing happened to my husband and me last month. We were separated despite booking together, and he," she gestured to a black man beside her, "ended up in the last row while I was in Economy Plus." Dominique absorbed this information, her expression thoughtful. "I'd like to hear from anyone else who has experienced or witnessed similar incidents," she said, raising her voice slightly to carry through the cabin. "This is not an official investigation at this moment, but your experiences matter." A ripple of responses came from throughout the economy section, passengers sharing stories, comparing experiences, or simply expressing outrage at the situation they were witnessing. Sophia Rodriguez stood silently, her discomfort visibly growing as the testimonials continued. As Dominique listened to passenger after passenger describe similar experiences, she felt a growing internal conflict. The regulator in her wanted to maintain professional distance to gather evidence methodically for a formal investigation. But the woman who had just experienced humiliating discrimination felt a powerful connection to these shared stories. "Director Reynolds," a man's voice called from a few rows ahead. "Kevin Mitchell, frequent flyer. I've flown North Star for Business Weekly for 15 years. What they did to you today, I've seen it happen dozens of times to other black passengers. It's so routine that most white travelers don't even notice anymore." Dominique nodded, acknowledging his observation. "That normalization is precisely what makes this pattern so insidious, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you for speaking up." "Ms. Rodriguez," Dominique said, finally returning her attention to the flight attendant. "Are you familiar with North Star's passenger prioritization system?" Sophia hesitated, conflict evident on her face. We have procedures for upgrades based on loyalty status," she said carefully. "And are there unofficial procedures as well?" Dominique pressed. "Ones that aren't published in the airline's public materials." Before Sophia could answer, a commotion from the front of the cabin drew everyone's attention. Captain Peterson was making his way down the aisle, followed closely by Laura Wilson. His expression was a mixture of concern and professional composure. "Director Reynolds," he said as he reached the last row. "I apologize for the confusion. If you'd please come with me to the cockpit, we can discuss this matter privately." "Captain Peterson," Dominique replied, her voice carrying clearly. "I appreciate the offer, but I think we should have this conversation right here. After all, your crew made a very public display of moving me to this seat. It seems only fitting that the resolution be equally transparent." Passengers throughout the cabin had fallen silent, watching the confrontation with rapt attention. Many had phones out recording the unprecedented scene. Director Peterson tried again, lowering his voice for security reasons. "The only security issue on this aircraft," Captain Dominique interrupted firmly, "is the apparent policy of discriminating against passengers based on their race. That's not just an ethical problem. It potentially violates federal aviation regulations and civil rights laws." Peterson's face tightened. "That's a serious accusation with no basis in fact." Isn't it?" Dominique challenged. "Then perhaps you can explain why, as a Platinum Elite member with a confirmed business class seat, I was removed from that seat and placed in the last row of economy, and why, based on the testimonials I'm hearing, this appears to be part of a pattern." The captain glanced uncomfortably at the passengers around them, many of whom were nodding in agreement with Dominique's assessment. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," he began, but Dominique held up a hand. "Captain, I believe we've moved beyond the realm of misunderstanding. Now, I have two immediate concerns first. The apparently discriminatory seating practices of North Star Airways, and second, a potential safety issue that the Secretary of Transportation was calling about when your flight attendant attempted to prevent me from taking that call." Peterson's expression shifted, professional concern overriding his discomfort. What safety issue? Dominique's phone buzzed again. A text from the Secretary. Urgent maintenance records show pattern of deferred safety checks on specific routes. Need your immediate review. She showed the message to Captain Peterson, whose expression grew more serious. "This requires immediate attention," he acknowledged. Indeed, Dominique agreed. And it raises questions about whether North Star's prioritization extends beyond seating assignments to safety protocols as well. That suggestion sent a visible ripple of concern through the nearby passengers. Gabriel Morales, still recording, zoomed in on the captain's reaction. Director Reynolds Peterson said, his voice now lower and more urgent. "I assure you that safety is our absolute priority. Whatever seating, irregularities may have occurred, they have no bearing on our maintenance or operational safety standards." "I'd like to verify that personally," Dominique replied, "which is why I'll need access to the maintenance records for this aircraft and your internal communications regarding safety protocol implementation across different routes." Laura Wilson, who had been standing silently behind the captain, stepped forward. "Director, that would require corporate authorization. We don't have access to those records on board." Ms. Wilson Dominique countered as FAA Director. "I have statutory authority to inspect any commercial aircraft and review any records relevant to safety and regulatory compliance. Your cooperation isn't optional. It's legally required." The balance of power had shifted completely. What began as a routine exercise of discriminatory policy had escalated into a federal investigation with the highest aviation authority in the country, seated in the very row where they had attempted to banish her. "Of course," Captain Peterson conceded. "How would you like to proceed?" "First," Dominique replied, "I'd like to remain exactly where I am for now. The last row provides an excellent vantage point to observe your crew's interactions with passengers throughout the cabin." She gestured to Sofia Rodriguez. "Ms. Rodriguez, you appear uncomfortable with the situation. I'm guessing this isn't the first time you've been asked to implement policies you find troubling." Sophia glanced nervously at Captain Peterson and Laura before responding. "No, ma'am. I mean, Director. It's not the first time. Would you be willing to provide testimony about North Star's seating policies and how they're implemented?" Dominique asked. Before Sophia could answer, Laura interjected sharply. "Any internal procedures are proprietary and confidential. Not when they potentially violate federal regulations," Dominique corrected. "Ms. Rodriguez, please consider my question carefully. Whistleblower protections would apply to any testimony you provide." The cabin had fallen completely silent, every passenger riveted by the drama unfolding in the last row. Sophia looked from Laura to Dominique, clearly weighing a career-defining decision. "I'll testify," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "This has gone on too long." Laura's face hardened with anger, but before she could respond, Captain Peterson put a restraining hand on her arm. "We will cooperate fully with any official investigation," he stated for the benefit of everyone listening. "Excellent," Dominique said. "Now about that safety issue the Secretary mentioned." As Peterson and Dominique began discussing the maintenance concerns, Beatrice Johnson leaned closer to her. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she whispered. Someone with real power experiencing what we've endured silently for decades. Dominique squeezed the elderly woman's hand gently. Ms. Johnson, your experiences and perspective are invaluable. Would you be willing to provide formal testimony as well? Beatrice's eyes shone with unshed tears as she nodded. Child, I've been waiting 67 years for someone to ask me that question. In that moment, Dominique felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, not just as FAA director charged with ensuring aviation safety, but as someone uniquely positioned to address a pattern of discrimination that had affected countless travelers. The last row, intended as a place of diminishment, had instead become the launching point for what promised to be a profound reckoning. The aircraft remained parked on the taxiway, engines idling as tension filled the cabin. In the last row, Beatrice Johnson turned to Jeffrey Davis with a knowing smile. In all my years of flying, she said, I've never seen anything quite like this. Do you think they'll get fired? Jeffrey wondered, glancing toward the front of the plane where Dominique had disappeared with Captain Peterson. Sun firing might be the least of their worries, Beatrice replied. That woman isn't just any government official. The FAA director has the authority to ground entire airlines if serious violations are found. Near the middle of the economy cabin, Gabriel Morales was providing a hushed commentary to his phone camera. I'm still on North Star Flight 1842, where the FAA director herself was just discriminated against and moved to the last row. She's now in the cockpit, and we've been holding position for about 10 minutes. The atmosphere in here is electric. Laura Wilson moved through the cabin, attempting to maintain an appearance of normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances. Everything is fine, folks, she announced, her voice betraying a slight tremor. We're just working through a minor issue and should be on our way shortly. Minor issue, Eleanor Foster challenged from her seat. You just discriminated against the head of the Federal Aviation Administration. There's nothing minor about that. Other passengers joined in their previous reluctance to speak out, now overcome by the revelation of Dominique's identity. I saw the whole thing. They treated her like she didn't belong. This has been going on for years. Laura's professional veneer cracked slightly. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. This situation is under control. Sophia Rodriguez stood in the galley, visibly distressed as she watched the cabin's mood deteriorate. Thomas Bennett was nowhere to be seen, presumably in the cockpit with the others. Meanwhile, in the confined space of the cockpit, Dominique was engaged in an intense phone conversation with Secretary of Transportation Michael Williams. Captain Peterson sat rigidly in his seat, while First Officer James Wilson monitored the aircraft systems, occasionally glancing nervously at the FAA director. Yes, Secretary. I'm looking at the preliminary data now, Dominique said, examining the tablet Peterson had reluctantly provided. There does appear to be a pattern consistent with the reports we received. She listened for a moment, then continued. No, I don't believe it's isolated to this flight or this crew. Based on passenger testimonials and the documentation I'm reviewing, this appears to be a structured policy potentially originating at the executive level. Captain Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Director Reynolds, I want to assure you that safety is our absolute priority at North Star. Dominique held up one finger, silencing him as she continued her conversation. The immediate concern is addressing both the discrimination issue and the potential safety implications. Yes, I agree. She turned to Peterson. Captain Secretary Williams is authorizing an immediate safety and compliance inspection of this aircraft before it's cleared for departure. Additionally, I'll need access to the complete passenger manifest and seating assignments for all North Star flights over the past 30 days. Peterson's face paled. Director, that would require corporate approval. I don't have the authority. Captain Dominique interrupted, her tone firm, but measured perhaps I wasn't clear. This isn't a request. The FAA has statutory authority to inspect any commercial aircraft and review any records relevant to safety and regulatory compliance. Your cooperation isn't optional. It's legally required. First Officer Wilson cleared his throat. Captain, she's right. FAA regulations are explicit on this point. Peterson's jaw tightened. What exactly are you looking for? Direct evidence of a structured policy of passenger discrimination which potentially creates an unsafe environment and violates multiple federal regulations, Dominique replied. But more immediately, I need to verify that no safety shortcuts have been taken in service of these discriminatory practices. She turned her attention back to the phone. Secretary Williams, I'll need a digital forensics team at O'Hare when we land. And please contact Chairwoman Turner at the NTSB. This may fall under their investigative purview as well if we find any safety compromises. The gravity of the situation was now unmistakable. What had begun as a seemingly routine incident of discrimination had escalated into a federal investigation with potentially far-reaching consequences for North Star Airways. One more thing, Secretary Dominique continued. I believe we should notify the Civil Rights Division at Justice. The pattern emerging here goes well beyond aviation regulations. Inside, Dominique struggled with mixed emotions. The professional part of her knew this investigation was necessary and overdue. Yet personally, she felt uncomfortable with how her own experience of discrimination had catalyzed it. Would she have launched such a comprehensive response if she hadn't been the target? Was she allowing her personal feelings to influence her professional judgment? Am I overreacting because this happened to me? She wondered silently, the doubt creeping in despite her outward confidence. She thought of her father's medal in her pocket, of his stories about maintaining dignity and purpose even when facing far worse discrimination. She thought of Beatrice Johnson and the decades of similar experiences she had endured without recourse. And she thought of all the passengers who had come forward with their own stories, grateful that someone with authority was finally taking action. No, this wasn't about her. This was about a pattern that needed addressing regardless of how it had been discovered. As she concluded the call, Thomas Bennett appeared at the cockpit door, his expression a mixture of anxiety and indignation. Captain, the passengers are becoming increasingly agitated. Laura is having difficulty maintaining order. I'm not surprised, Dominique commented. When people witness injustice and then discover it's part of a pattern, they tend to react strongly. She turned to Captain Peterson. We have two options here, Captain. We can return to the gate where a full inspection team will board and likely delay this flight for hours, or you can authorize me to address the passengers, explain the situation, and conduct a preliminary inspection while we continue to Chicago where a more thorough investigation will take place. Peterson considered his limited options. And if I choose the second option, then I'll need your full cooperation and complete transparency, Dominique replied, starting with an acknowledgement of what happened and access to the crew briefing notes from this morning. The captain hesitated clearly, weighing professional self-preservation against the reality of his situation. Finally, he nodded. We'll proceed to Chicago. You'll have whatever you need. Wise choice, Dominique said, rising from her seat. Now I think it's time I address your passengers. As she prepared to leave the cockpit, First Officer James Wilson spoke quietly. Director Reynolds, there's something you should know. I've been documenting the route-based maintenance differentials for months. I can provide those records if they would be helpful to your investigation. Dominique looked at him with newfound appreciation. They would be extremely helpful, First Officer Wilson. Whistleblower protections would apply to you as well. I understand. He nodded. This isn't just about seating. It's about a corporate culture that has normalized discrimination in multiple ways. Captain Peterson glared at his first officer, but remained silent, recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond his control. As Dominique exited the cockpit, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had begun as a personal humiliation was evolving into an opportunity to address institutional problems that affected thousands of travelers. The doubt that had briefly surfaced gave way to determination not for personal vindication, but for systemic change. The main cabin fell silent as Dominique's voice came through the aircraft's PA system. Every passenger from business class to the last row listened intently to the unprecedented announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dominique Reynolds, Director of the Federal Aviation Administration. I apologize for the delay in our departure. As some of you may have witnessed, I was originally seated in business class before being involuntarily relocated to the last row of the aircraft. What began as a personal inconvenience has revealed what appears to be a potentially widespread pattern of discriminatory practices at North Star Airways. In the galley, Laura Wilson stood frozen, her face drained of color. Sofia Rodriguez watched her senior colleague's reaction with a mixture of vindication and apprehension. Dominique continued, her voice calm but authoritative. As FAA Director, I have a responsibility to ensure that all airlines operate not only safely, but also in compliance with federal regulations prohibiting discrimination. Captain Peterson has agreed to cooperate fully with a preliminary investigation which will continue more thoroughly upon our arrival in Chicago. In business class, Robert Thompson and other executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Angela Barnes, who had witnessed the initial confrontation, now smiled with satisfaction. For transparency, Dominique went on, I want to explain what will happen next. First, we will proceed to Chicago as scheduled. There is no immediate safety concern that would require us to return to Washington. Second, upon arrival, federal investigators will meet this aircraft to gather additional evidence and take statements from any passengers who wish to share their experiences. Gabriel Morales, still recording, nodded approvingly. Eleanor Foster sat with perfect posture, a look of vindication on her face. Third, I want to assure every passenger on this flight that your cooperation and patience are deeply appreciated. What you have witnessed today, and what many of you have apparently experienced previously, is not just a customer service issue. It potentially represents a violation of your civil rights as passengers. In the last row, Beatrice Johnson closed her eyes briefly, a lifetime of similar indignities reflected in her expression. Finally, Dominique concluded, I want to address the North Star crew directly. Those of you who were following what you believed to be company policy now face a decision. You can continue to enforce discriminatory practices, or you can become part of the solution by providing honest testimony about the directives you've received. That choice will significantly impact both your personal futures and the future of commercial aviation in this country. She paused for a moment before adding, Thank you for your attention. We should be departing shortly. As Dominique handed the microphone back to Captain Peterson, the cabin erupted in scattered applause led by Eleanor Foster and quickly joined by most of the economy passengers. Even a few business-class travelers participated, though others sat in uncomfortable silence. Thomas Bennett stood at the forward galley, visibly shaken. This is a disaster, he muttered to Laura. Parker is going to kill us. Parker is going to have much bigger problems, Laura replied grimly. Did you hear her mention federal investigators? This could bring down the entire airline. Sophia approached them cautiously. Maybe it should, she said quietly. You know this isn't right. It never was. Thomas rounded on her. Don't pretend you're somehow above this, Rodriguez. You've been part of the same system. A system I questioned this very morning, Sophia countered. A system I'm now going to tell the truth about. Laura's eyes widened. You wouldn't dare. Watch me, Sophia replied, turning away from her colleagues and walking deliberately toward the rear of the aircraft where Dominique had reappeared from the cockpit. As Dominique made her way back through the cabin, passengers reached out, some offering words of support, others sharing brief accounts of their own experiences on North Star flights. She acknowledged each one respectfully, promising that their concerns would be addressed. Gabriel Morales stepped into the aisle as she passed. Director Reynolds Gabriel Morales with Travel Truth magazine. "Would you be willing to provide a statement about what's happening here, Mr. Morales?" Dominique replied. "I appreciate your documentation of these events. While I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, I can say this: what happened today appears to reflect a broader issue that merits thorough examination. Your video evidence may prove invaluable in that process." When she finally reached the last row, Beatrice Johnson took her hand. "You did what many of us could never do," she said softly. "Made them see us." "Ms. Johnson," Dominique replied, "people like you paved the way for this moment. I'm standing on your shoulders." As she settled back into her seat, Dominique felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her. This was no longer just about one incident or one flight. It had become about addressing patterns of discrimination that had persisted for decades, normalized to the point of invisibility for those not directly affected. She took out her phone, sending a quick text to her daughter, Amara. "I need your help. Organize that student team immediately. We're going to need comprehensive data on airline discrimination patterns going back decades." Amara's response came quickly. "Already on it. 5 law students confirmed." "What happened?" "I'll explain later," Dominique replied. "But your research just became part of an official federal investigation." Sofia Rodriguez approached her expression resolute, despite her obvious nervousness. "Director Reynolds, I need to speak with you. About the briefing this morning. About the policies." Dominique nodded. "I thought you might, Ms. Rodriguez. Let's talk." As the 2 women conferred quietly at the rear of the aircraft, the cabin began to settle into an uneasy calm. The initial shock had given way to a dawning realization among everyone on Flight 1942. They were no longer just passengers on a routine flight from Washington to Chicago. They had become witnesses to, and participants in a pivotal moment that would likely transform air travel for years to come. Captain Peterson's voice came over the PA system. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The engines powered up and the aircraft began to move once again toward the runway. But nothing about this journey would proceed according to North Star's original flight plan. Dominique leaned back in her seat, feeling the vibration of the engines through the aircraft frame. Despite her outward composure, she was engaged in an internal struggle. Had she overreacted? Was she using her position inappropriately? Or was this exactly why she had been appointed to address long-standing issues that others had ignored or normalized? She thought of her father, of the barriers he had faced, and the dignity with which he had confronted them. She thought of all the passengers who had shared similar stories, grateful that someone was finally listening. And she thought of the transportation system she was responsible for, overseeing a system that should serve all travelers equally, regardless of their appearance. No, this wasn't an overreaction. This was exactly what her position required of her. The fact that she had experienced the discrimination personally only provided first-hand insight into issues that warranted investigation, regardless of how they had been discovered. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, Dominique felt a renewed sense of purpose. The last row, intended as a place of diminishment, had instead become a vantage point from which long overdue change might finally begin. The atmosphere aboard Flight 1942 transformed as the aircraft climbed through the clouds. What had begun as a routine morning flight had become an impromptu federal investigation, with the most powerful aviation official in the country conducting interviews from the last row of economy class. Captain Peterson remained in the cockpit, his communications now limited to essential flight information. First Officer James Wilson had quietly distanced himself from his captain, making it clear to Dominique that he was willing to provide his own testimony regarding North Star's practices. In the forward galley, Laura Wilson and Thomas Bennett huddled in tense conversation, occasionally casting worried glances toward the rear of the aircraft. Their previously commanding presence had diminished dramatically, their authority undermined by the revelation of Dominique's identity and the subsequent shift in passenger sentiment. Director Reynolds, Sofia Rodriguez, explained, her voice low but steady, as they sat in the last row. The passenger prioritization system is officially called Blue Sky Protocol. It's never documented in writing, but it's taught to all senior crew members during their advanced service training. Dominique took notes on her tablet. And what exactly does this protocol entail? It categorizes passengers beyond their published loyalty tiers, Sophia explained. There are coded designations in the system P1 through P5. P1 is the highest priority reserved for white male executives with corporate accounts. P5 is... She hesitated. Is what Ms. Rodriguez Dominique prompted gently. P5 is what they call image impact passengers. Basically, anyone the airline feels doesn't project the premium image they want in business or first class. Predominantly black and brown travelers, regardless of their status level. Beatrice Johnson, still seated by the window, shook her head sadly. New system, same old discrimination. Do you have evidence of these categories? Dominique asked. Sophia nodded. Nothing written, but the internal booking system uses these codes. They're visible to crew on our tablets. And... She hesitated again. Please continue. Dominique encouraged. Your testimony is protected under federal whistleblower statutes. CEO William Parker personally reviews premium cabin manifests for certain routes, Sophia revealed. Chicago to Seattle is one of them. He's scheduled to be on the return flight this afternoon. He sends emails to crew supervisors when he feels the cabin demographics don't meet his expectations. Jeffrey Davis, who had been listening from his aisle seat, leaned forward. Director Reynolds. I'm an IT security consultant. If these codes exist in their system, a forensic examination would reveal them even if there's no written policy. An excellent point, Mr. Davis Dominique acknowledged. The Secretary is arranging for just such a team to meet us in Chicago. Gabriel Morales approached from his seat several rows ahead. Director, my video of the incident has already received over 50,000 views online. News networks are picking it up. North Star's stock dropped 7 points in the last 30 minutes. Dominique nodded, unsurprised. Mr. Morales, while I appreciate the documentation, I hope you understand that my concern is regulatory compliance and passenger rights, not market impacts. Of course, Gabriel replied, but the public reaction is forcing accountability in real time. North Star's corporate communications team just issued a statement claiming this was an isolated incident being investigated internally. Eleanor Foster, who had relocated to a nearby seat despite flight attendants' objections, scoffed audibly. Isolated, I've witnessed dozens of similar incidents over the years. Never this blatant, but the pattern has been clear. Throughout the cabin, other passengers had begun sharing their own experiences, many approaching the growing gathering at the back of the plane, despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. A spontaneous community was forming, united by the shared recognition of an injustice many had witnessed, but few had challenged. As the impromptu testimony session continued, Dominique's phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Amara team assembled. We've already found 127 similar complaints against North Star in public records from the past 3 years alone. Working on database structure now. Dominique smiled briefly at her daughter's efficiency before returning her attention to the gathering passengers. Director, a middle-aged black man, said as he joined the group, Marshall Taylor, frequent North Star flyer. 3 weeks ago, I was downgraded from my confirmed first-class seat on a flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. The explanation was a system error. After seeing what happened to you, I'm beginning to understand it wasn't an error at all. Similar stories accumulated rapidly, painting a picture of a widespread, consistent pattern. Dominique documented each account methodically, building what was quickly becoming an overwhelming case against North Star Airways. Meanwhile, in a secure conference room at North Star's corporate headquarters, CEO William Parker had just received the news that would upend his day and potentially his career. His executive vice president of operations had called an emergency meeting, and the grim expressions around the table told him everything he needed to know before a word was spoken. What happened? Parker demanded, his normally commanding voice tinged with apprehension. Sir, there's been an incident on Flight 1942 from Washington to Chicago. His VP began cautiously. The FAA director was aboard traveling privately. She was subjected to our blue sky protocol and moved to the last row of economy. Parker's face drained of color. Dominique Reynolds was on our flight and got downgraded. Yes, sir. It appears the crew didn't recognize her and applied standard procedure for demographic optimization of premium cabins. Parker slammed his hand on the conference table. Are you telling me that the head of the Federal Aviation Administration, the woman whose regulations we're fighting tomorrow, was personally discriminated against on one of our flights? It's worse, the VP continued. She's launched an immediate federal investigation. She's taking passenger testimonies aboard the aircraft right now. The video is already viral with over 200,000 views in the last 40 minutes. Parker stood abruptly. I want our legal team in here immediately. And get me on the next flight to Chicago. I need to contain this personally. Back on Flight 1942, from her seat in the last row, Dominique Reynolds was undertaking one of the most unusual investigations of her career. The discriminatory incident that had begun as a personal affront had revealed what appeared to be a structured system affecting countless travelers. And with every testimony she gathered, the pattern became clearer and more disturbing. Ms. Rodriguez-Dominique asked as their discussion continued, does this prioritization system extend beyond seating assignments? Sophia nodded reluctantly. Routes with predominantly white affluent passengers receive priority for newer aircraft and more frequent maintenance checks. The official explanation is premium route requirements, but the correlation with passenger demographics is unmistakable. This revelation shifted the investigation from a civil rights concern to a potential safety issue, exactly what the Secretary of Transportation had warned about in his initial call. Dominique's expression grew more serious. That's extremely concerning. Do you have documentation of these maintenance differentials? First Officer Wilson does? Sophia confirmed. He's been tracking the patterns for months, trying to build a case internally. He's prepared to share everything with your investigation. The aircraft began its initial descent into Chicago, the seatbelt signs illuminating once more. As passengers reluctantly returned to their assigned seats, the cabin buzzed with conversation, speculation, and a growing sense that they were part of something historic, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of a major airline had cracked, revealing the troubling reality beneath. For Dominique Reynolds, seated once again in the last row, the journey that had begun with humiliation was transforming into something far more significant, an opportunity to address not just a personal slight, but a deeply entrenched problem that had affected countless travelers before her. The last row, intended as a punishment, had instead become the seat of power from which a long overdue reckoning would begin. Director Jeffrey Davis said quietly as the aircraft descended through clouds toward Chicago, "You should know that people are calling this the last row revolution on social media. Your decision to stay in this seat rather than demand reinstatement to business class has become symbolic." Dominique hadn't considered the optics of her choice, having made it primarily to observe crew behavior throughout the cabin. But she recognized the power of symbols in movements for change. Sometimes, she replied, thinking of her father, dignity isn't about where you sit, but how you carry yourself wherever you are. Beside her, Beatrice Johnson nodded in quiet understanding. That's a lesson some of us learned long ago, child. I'm just grateful to see it finally making a difference. As Flight 1942 continued its descent into Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, Dominique Reynolds conducted a methodical preliminary safety inspection from her position in the last row. What had begun as a response to discriminatory treatment had expanded into a comprehensive examination of North Star's overall operational practices. Ms. Rodriguez Dominique said, reviewing documents on her tablet, these maintenance deferral records show a concerning pattern. 13 non-critical but recommended safety items have been pushed back multiple times on this specific aircraft. Sophia nodded grimly. That's consistent with what many of us have observed. Maintenance issues that don't absolutely ground the aircraft are routinely deferred, especially on routes considered less premium. Less premium meaning, Dominique prompted. Routes with more diverse passenger demographics, Sophia clarified. Atlanta, Detroit, Baltimore, they receive lower maintenance priority than routes to places like Martha's Vineyard or Aspen. Jeffrey Davis, the IT consultant who had remained engaged in the investigation, leaned forward. Director Reynolds, that could potentially create a two-tiered safety system correlating with racial demographics. That's beyond discriminatory. It's genuinely dangerous. Precisely my concern, Mr. Davis. Dominique agreed, making additional notes. From several rows ahead, a voice called out, "Director, I think there's something else you should know." The speaker was a middle-aged black man in a pilot's uniform who had been traveling as a passenger. "James Wilson, first officer, but not related to your flight crew. I'm deadheading back to Chicago." "Go ahead, First Officer Wilson," Dominique encouraged. "I've been with North Star for 11 years, he explained, moving to join their group. "In the past 3 years under Parker's leadership, we've seen a steady erosion of what I'd call safety margins. Nothing that violates minimum standards, but a consistent push to operate at the very edge of those standards." "Can you provide specific examples?" Dominique asked. Wilson nodded. "Fuel loads calculated at absolute minimums rather than comfortable margins. Maintenance items deferred to the maximum allowed time limits. Weather diversion decisions increasingly pushed to financial rather than safety considerations." "And have these practices been applied uniformly across all routes?" Dominique pressed. "No," Wilson replied firmly. "Premium routes receive more conservative planning. The routes Parker considers less important, typically those serving more diverse communities, operate with tighter margins." Beatrice Johnson shook her head sadly. "So it's not just where they seat us, but how safely they fly us too." Dominique's expression remained professional, but her eyes revealed her growing concern. "First Officer Wilson, would you be willing to provide formal testimony to this effect?" "That's why I'm speaking up now," he confirmed. "Many of us have been uncomfortable with these trends, but the company culture strongly discourages raising concerns." Sophia Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "They call it operational efficiency, but the patterns are clear when you look at the data." Dominique reached for the aircraft's maintenance logbook, which Captain Peterson had reluctantly provided. The manual was supposed to document all safety checks, repairs, and maintenance deferrals. But as she flipped through it, she noticed discrepancies. "These entries don't match the electronic records you showed me," she noted, comparing the logbook to Sophia's tablet display. "They maintain 2 records," First Officer Wilson explained. "The paper logbook is what's shown during routine FAA inspections. The electronic system tracks what's actually happening with maintenance scheduling." "That's a serious violation," Dominique said, her concern deepening. "Falsifying maintenance records is a federal offense." The seatbelt sign illuminated as the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet. Captain Peterson's voice came over the PA system, notably terse. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival." Laura Wilson moved through the aisle, her usual authority diminished by the circumstances. "Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts," she announced mechanically. As passengers complied, Dominique completed her notes and secured her tablet. "Ms. Rodriguez, First Officer Wilson, I'll need both of you to make yourselves available to federal investigators upon landing. Your testimony will be crucial." "Of course," Sophia agreed. "Whatever helps correct this situation." Beside Dominique, Beatrice Johnson fastened her seatbelt with practiced ease. In 67 years of flying, she remarked, "I never thought I'd see this day." someone with real power experiencing what the rest of us have endured silently for decades. Ms. Johnson, Dominique replied, "Your experiences and perspective are invaluable to this investigation. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement as well?" Beatrice smiled. "Child, I've been waiting my whole life to tell this story to someone who could actually do something about it." As the aircraft banked into its final approach, Dominique's phone vibrated with another message from Amara. "Team has cross-referenced maintenance records with route demographics. Found 84% correlation between maintenance deferral rates and racial makeup of destination cities. Sending data now." Dominique's heart sank as she reviewed the preliminary analysis. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. What had begun as an investigation into discriminatory seating practices had revealed a potential safety issue that put thousands of passengers at risk daily. Her phone buzzed again with a call from Secretary Williams. "Director, I've assembled a multi-agency response team at O'Hare. FAA safety inspectors, DOT Civil Rights Division, and FBI Transportation Fraud Unit are all standing by. This has escalated well beyond what we initially suspected." "I'm not surprised," Dominique replied. "The evidence suggests a structured approach to discrimination that extends to safety practices. We'll need to consider grounding their fleet until a comprehensive inspection can be completed." "Understood. I've already prepared the emergency directive. It just needs your sign-off upon landing." The wheels touched down with a firm jolt, and Captain Peterson's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 11:17 a.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." There was a notable absence of the usual welcomes and thanks in his announcement, a reflection of the unprecedented circumstances aboard Flight 1942. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, Dominique experienced a wave of self-doubt. Was she overreacting? Would grounding an entire airline affecting thousands of travelers and employees be seen as a disproportionate response to her personal experience of discrimination? She glanced at Beatrice Johnson, whose dignity in the face of decades of similar treatment provided perspective. She thought of First Officer Wilson and Sofia Rodriguez, risking their careers to expose practices they believed endangered passengers. And she remembered her father, who had fought for the right to fly in a country that questioned his very humanity. No, this wasn't an overreaction. This was her responsibility as FAA director to ensure both safety and equity in the nation's air transportation system. The aircraft came to a stop at the gate, but the expected announcement permitting passengers to unfasten seatbelts and collect belongings didn't immediately follow. Instead, through the windows, passengers could see unusual activity on the jetway, individuals in dark suits and FAA windbreakers assembling. Finally, Captain Peterson's voice returned noticeably strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to remain in position while federal officials board the aircraft. Please stay seated until further notice." Thomas Bennett approached from the forward cabin, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. "Director Reynolds," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "before the investigators come aboard. I'd like to speak with you privately." Dominique regarded him steadily. "Mr. Bennett, there is no privately at this point. Whatever you wish to say can be stated formally to investigators." "Please," he insisted. "I was following established protocols, but I never understood the full implications until today. I want to cooperate fully." "That's a wise decision," Dominique acknowledged. "And you'll have that opportunity very soon." The main cabin door opened and 3 FAA officials boarded, moving directly toward the rear, where Dominique waited. The lead investigator, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, approached with professional efficiency. "Director Reynolds," she said, "I'm Senior Investigator Helen Martinez. Secretary Williams has briefed us on the situation. We're prepared to begin the formal investigation." "Thank you," Investigator Martinez Dominique replied, rising from her seat. "I believe we've uncovered issues that go well beyond discriminatory seating practices. There are potentially serious safety implications that require immediate attention." Martinez nodded gravely. We've assembled a full team FAA safety inspectors, DOT Civil Rights Division, and NTSB representatives are all standing by. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the cabin had grown increasingly tense. Passengers watched the exchange with rapt attention while North Star crew members stood rigid with apprehension. This was no longer simply about one passenger's experience or even one airline's policies. It had become about fundamental questions of equity, safety, and accountability in American commercial aviation. Dominique surveyed the cabin one last time before addressing Investigator Martinez. "Let's proceed. We have a lot of work to do." With that, the formal investigation of North Star Airways began, triggered by a simple act of discrimination, but now expanded into something far more consequential. For everyone aboard Flight 1942, the journey that had begun in Washington, D.C., had arrived at a destination none of them had anticipated. William Parker paced the confines of the executive conference room at North Star's O'Hare Operations Center, his normally composed demeanor fracturing with each update from his crisis management team. At 58, Parker had built his reputation as a ruthlessly efficient CEO who had transformed North Star from a struggling regional carrier into the nation's third-largest airline in just 7 years. How the hell did Dominique Reynolds end up on one of our flights without us knowing? He demanded, his voice sharp with barely contained fury. And more importantly, how did our crew manage to downgrade the FAA director to the last row? Victoria Ramirez, North Star's chief legal officer, maintained her professional calm despite the escalating crisis. The booking was made through her personal frequent flyer account, not through official government channels. There was no flag in the system to identify her. And now we have federal investigators swarming our aircraft, our stock in freefall, and social media exploding with hashtags like #LastRowJustice and #GroundNorthStarParker, continued gesturing at the multiple screens displaying real-time coverage of the unfolding situation. "This is a catastrophe, people." The conference room door opened, and Jonathan Phillips, North Star's head of communications, entered with a grim expression. "Sir, we have a serious problem. Reynolds isn't just focusing on the seating incident. She's opened a broader investigation into our operational practices, including maintenance deferrals and route-based safety protocols." Parker froze mid-stride. "What exactly are you saying, Phillips?" "The blue sky documentation," Victoria Ramirez interjected quietly. "If they access those files, it's not just a PR crisis or even a civil rights issue. We're looking at potential criminal liability." The color drained from Parker's face. "Those protocols were approved by legal. You assured me they were carefully worded to avoid any explicit discrimination." Ramirez's expression remained carefully neutral. "They were worded to avoid explicit references to race or ethnicity, yes. But the correlation between our premium passenger profile categories and racial demographics is statistically undeniable. And if Reynolds has connected that to the maintenance prioritization matrix..." She let the implication hang in the air. Parker slammed his hand on the conference table. "I want every executive on site within the hour. No one speaks to federal investigators without legal present. Phillips, get our crisis communication plan activated, full transparency posture, complete cooperation. CEO taking personal responsibility for any misunderstandings or individual employee actions." Sir Phillips hesitated. "Social media is already flooded with passenger accounts from Flight 1942. Gabriel Morales' video has over 2 million views and is being picked up by major networks. The standard crisis playbook won't work here." "Then what do you suggest?" Parker demanded. "Full acknowledgement, immediate suspension of any policies that could be interpreted as discriminatory, and a comprehensive third-party audit," Phillips replied. "Anything less will be seen as inadequate." Parker's phone rang, the special line reserved for board members and major shareholders. He glanced at the display and grimaced. "It's Elizabeth Chandler." As CEO, Parker answered to North Star's board of directors, chaired by Elizabeth Chandler, a formidable executive known for her zero-tolerance approach to corporate scandals. Elizabeth Parker answered, forcing confidence into his voice. "I was just about to call you." The response was audible even to others in the room. "Save it, William. I'm on a video call with the entire board right now. You're on speaker." Parker swallowed hard, activating his phone's speaker function and placing it on the conference table. "I understand the situation looks concerning, but we're implementing our crisis response plan." This was clearly an isolated incident. "Stop right there," Chandler interrupted sharply. "We've all seen the video. We've all watched the passenger testimonials pouring in. This was not isolated, and pretending otherwise will only compound the disaster. The board has convened an emergency session and reached a unanimous decision." The conference room fell silent, every executive present understanding the gravity of those words. William Chandler continued, her voice steely. "You are hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. North Star's Chief Operating Officer Lucia Hernandez will assume interim CEO responsibilities pending a complete investigation." Parker stood stunned. "Elizabeth, you can't be serious. In the middle of this crisis, it is precisely because of this crisis that we're taking this action." Chandler cut him off. "The board has lost confidence in your leadership. More importantly, from what we're seeing, your policies have potentially exposed this company to catastrophic legal and regulatory liability." "My policies were approved by this board," Parker protested. "The Blue Sky Protocol was presented to us as a customer experience initiative focused on high-value passengers," Chandler replied coldly. "At no point was the board informed that it included racial profiling or that it impacted safety resource allocation. If you misrepresented these facts to the board, that's a separate issue entirely." Victoria Ramirez exchanged meaningful glances with Jonathan Phillips. The corporate lifeboats were being prepared, and Parker was clearly being positioned as the sacrifice. "Lucia will be arriving at O'Hare within the hour," Chandler continued. "Victoria, you'll work directly with her to coordinate our response to the federal investigation. William, you are to make yourself available to investigators but are relieved of all operational authority, effective immediately." The call ended abruptly, leaving Parker standing shell-shocked before his executive team. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "Sir Director Reynolds has requested a meeting once she completes her preliminary aircraft inspection. Given the board's decision, I recommend you decline and direct her to Lucia upon her arrival." Parker's expression darkened. "No. I built this airline. I'll face Reynolds myself before I'm pushed aside. William, Victoria cautioned anything you say can and will be used against both you and the company in potential litigation and regulatory actions. This is not the time for confrontation." "She's right," Phillips added. "The situation is volatile. A direct confrontation with Reynolds now would only escalate matters." Parker's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, his expression shifting from defiance to resignation. "It's too late anyway. Reynolds is declining to meet with me until her team has completed their initial investigation. She says, and I quote, 'Federal regulatory procedures take precedence over corporate damage control.'" In the uncomfortable silence that followed, each executive present seemed to be mentally calculating their own position in the unfolding disaster. Years of carefully constructed policies and practices designed to maximize profit while maintaining plausible deniability were unraveling in real time. Parker stared out the window at the tarmac where he could see Flight 11842 surrounded by federal vehicles. "You know what really burns me?" he said to no one in particular. "Tomorrow I was supposed to be arguing against her safety reforms as unnecessary and financially burdensome. Now she's got all the ammunition she needs to push them through, and worse. The maintenance protocols are our biggest vulnerability," Victoria noted. "If they prove a correlation between route demographics and safety resource allocation. I never authorized that Parker insisted rounding on his team. The Blue Sky Protocol was about customer demographics, not safety practices." Jonathan Phillips cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, The operational matrices you approved last year explicitly prioritized resource allocation to premium routes. While race wasn't mentioned, the correlation between route categorization and passenger demographics is statistically significant. It will be viewed as a structured approach to discrimination that extended to safety practices, Victoria concluded grimly. And that crosses the line from civil penalties to potential criminal charges. Parker slumped into a chair, the full implications finally hitting home. So that's it. Reynolds walks onto one of our flights, gets moved to the back, and my entire career is over. Not necessarily. Victoria replied, her legal mind already working on containment strategies. If you take full responsibility, acknowledge the issues, and actively cooperate with reform measures, there's a path forward. Not as CEO, perhaps, but with your reputation partially intact. Before Parker could respond, the door opened again. A woman in her early 50s entered, her expression resolute but calm. Lucia Hernandez had arrived already, carrying herself with the authority of the interim CEO. William, she acknowledged with a nod. Lucia, he replied stiffly. I suppose congratulations are in order. Hardly, she said grimly. I'm inheriting a company in crisis facing potential federal charges and hemorrhaging stock value by the minute. This isn't a victory, it's triage. She turned to the assembled executives. I need everyone's full cooperation. No hiding documents, no deleting emails, no coordinating testimonies. Complete transparency is our only path forward. Parker rose, preparing to leave. You'll get no resistance from me, Lucia. But remember, these policies didn't develop in a vacuum. The board pushed for higher margins and we delivered them. Through methods that crossed ethical and potentially legal boundaries, Lucia replied firmly. That stops today, whatever the cost. As Parker gathered his belongings and headed for the door, he paused. Word of advice, Lucia. Don't underestimate Reynolds. She's not just pursuing this because she was personally affected. She's using this incident to drive her broader agenda for industry reform. Perhaps Lucia acknowledged, but that doesn't make her wrong. Parker had no response to that. He left the room in silence, his ambitious vision for North Star Airways crumbling behind him. Once the door closed, Lucia turned to the remaining team. We have approximately 20 minutes before I meet with federal investigators. I need complete honesty about what we're facing. Who has direct knowledge of the Blue Sky Protocol implementation and the maintenance prioritization matrices? Hands rose reluctantly around the table. The reckoning that had begun aboard Flight 1942 had now reached the executive suite, and there was no turning back. Outside the conference room windows, they could see the commotion at Gate C-17 where Flight 1942 had docked. Federal officials moved purposefully between the aircraft and the terminal, while a growing media presence gathered at the periphery. The North Star logo, prominently displayed throughout the concourse, suddenly seemed less like a corporate emblem and more like a target. For William Parker, watching from the corridor as he headed toward an uncertain future, the view represented the potential collapse of everything he had built, triggered by a single decision to remove Dominique Reynolds from her rightful seat. It was a decision that would echo not just through his career, but potentially through the entire commercial aviation industry. While William Parker grappled with the corporate fallout at O'Hare, a remarkable development was taking place aboard Flight 1942, still docked at the gate. What had begun as a disparate group of witnesses to discrimination had evolved into something more organized and purposeful. A spontaneous coalition of passengers united by their shared experience and determination to see meaningful change. Director Reynolds Eleanor Foster called from her seat as Dominique conferred with federal investigators. Many of us would like to coordinate our testimonies. We want to ensure nothing falls through the cracks. Dominique approached Eleanor, impressed by the elderly woman's initiative. That would be extremely helpful, Ms. Foster. Corroborating accounts strengthen the investigation significantly. I've been practicing law for 40 years. Angela Barnes offered joining them. I'd be happy to help organize statements and ensure they meet evidentiary standards. Gabriel Morales, still documenting developments, added, "My footage provides visual evidence, but I've also been collecting contact information from passengers willing to share their experiences on other North Star flights." Beatrice Johnson, who had remained in the last row throughout the commotion, spoke up. "This isn't just about today. Some of us have lived with this treatment our entire lives. That history matters too." Dominique nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Johnson. The pattern over time is crucial to understanding the full scope of the issue." What emerged over the next 30 minutes, as federal investigators moved systematically through the aircraft collecting statements, was a remarkably diverse yet unified group of witnesses. Passengers from various backgrounds, ages, and professions found common purpose in documenting what they had observed, not just on Flight 1942, but across years of air travel experiences. Jeffrey Davis had created an impromptu digital repository using his laptop where passengers could record key details of their experiences. Angela Barnes helped structure these accounts to highlight legally relevant information. Eleanor Foster, drawing on her decades of North Star flights, provided historical context that revealed how discriminatory practices had evolved over time. Sofia Rodriguez, having made the difficult decision to become a whistleblower, provided critical insider perspective. "The Blue Sky Protocol isn't just about seating," she explained to a small group gathered near the mid-cabin galley. "It extends to meal service priorities, response times to call buttons, even how complimentary upgrades are distributed." "And you were trained in this officially?" Angela asked, taking careful notes. "Never in writing," Sophia clarified. "Always verbal instruction during training, with emphasis that these were unwritten professional standards expected of senior crew." First Officer James Wilson, who had been deadheading as a passenger, contributed his own observations about operational disparities. Routes with predominantly white affluent passengers received different treatment in everything from maintenance scheduling to delay management decisions. As the coalition grew and organized, Laura Wilson observed from the forward galley with increasing concern. "This is a coordinated attack on our airline," she whispered to Thomas Bennett. "They're building a class action case right in front of us." Thomas, whose earlier confidence had entirely evaporated, shook his head. "No, Laura. They're documenting what we've been doing all along. There's a difference." The distinction wasn't lost on Laura, whose expression reflected a dawning recognition of her own complicity. After a moment of internal struggle, she straightened her uniform and approached investigator Helen Martinez. "I'd like to provide a statement," she said quietly, "about the pre-flight briefing and the directives we received from executive leadership." Martinez nodded, gesturing to a colleague to record Laura's testimony. "That would be very helpful, Ms. Wilson." Near the rear of the aircraft, Beatrice Johnson had become a focal point for older passengers, sharing decades of similar experiences. Her dignified bearing and articulate recounting of historical discrimination in air travel created a powerful narrative thread connecting past injustices to present practices. In 1962, she told the group gathered around her, "I was removed from a first-class seat despite having a valid ticket." The explanation then was passenger comfort concerns. Today they call it a verification issue, or system error. The words change, but the intent remains the same. Gabriel Morales, recording this testimony with Beatrice's permission, asked, "What gives you hope that this time will be different?" Beatrice gestured toward Dominique, who was conferring with investigators near the front of the cabin. "Because for once the person experiencing the discrimination has the power to change the system. That's never happened before." Dominique, overhearing this exchange, felt a wave of emotion that threatened her professional composure. The weight of responsibility, not just as a regulator, but as someone carrying the hopes of generations who had faced similar discrimination, pressed heavily on her shoulders. "Am I the right person for this moment?" she wondered silently. "Can I truly do justice to all these experiences?" Her phone buzzed with a text from Amara. "Mom, we've compiled testimonies from 47 former North Star employees. They all confirm structured discrimination in training and operations. You're not alone in this fight. The message came at exactly the right moment, reminding Dominique that this wasn't about her bearing the burden alone. It was about catalyzing a collective response to long-standing injustice. As the preliminary investigation continued, passengers who might normally have been impatient to deplane instead remained seated, contributing to what had become a remarkable collective testimonial. The shared purpose transcended the inconvenience, creating an atmosphere of solidarity that crossed demographic lines. Captain Peterson emerged briefly from the cockpit, surveying the scene with evident discomfort before approaching Dominique. "Director Reynolds," he said stiffly, "I've received communication from North Star Operations. Interim CEO Lucia Hernandez is en route to O'Hare and requests to meet with you upon arrival." Interim CEO Dominique questioned. "What happened to William Parker?" "Apparently," Peterson replied, choosing his words carefully, "the board has placed him on administrative leave, pending investigation of these matters." The news traveled quickly through the cabin, triggering a fresh wave of discussion among the passenger coalition. The implications were significant, a major corporation taking decisive action even before the federal investigation had concluded. Eleanor Foster summed up the sentiment. "They're throwing Parker overboard to save the ship. Classic crisis management. But it won't be enough," Angela Barnes observed. "Not with this much evidence of structured discrimination. The issues go beyond one executive's decisions." Dominique turned to Investigator Martinez. "We need to ensure this doesn't become about a single bad actor. The evidence suggests institutional patterns that require structural reform, not just personnel changes." Martinez nodded in agreement. "That's consistent with our preliminary findings. The documentation we've already secured shows this extends far beyond individual actors." As they discussed next steps, Dominique's phone rang. It was Secretary Williams again. "Director, the White House has been briefed on the situation. The President wants to know if you need additional resources or authorities." Dominique stepped away from the group to take the call, suddenly feeling the full weight of the political dimensions. What had begun as a personal experience of discrimination was now drawing attention from the highest levels of government. "Mr. Secretary," she replied, "at this point we have the resources we need for the immediate investigation. But I am concerned about potential resistance or obstruction once we move beyond the preliminary phase. We're likely to encounter significant pushback from industry lobbying groups." "Understood," Williams replied. "The President has authorized me to tell you that you have full backing for whatever regulatory actions you deem necessary. The evidence you've already uncovered is compelling." As Dominique ended the call, she noticed a group of passengers who had formed a small circle near the middle of the aircraft. They were of various ages and backgrounds, but their expressions shared a common intensity and purpose. "Director Reynolds," one woman called out, "we've started a passenger advocacy group, right here on the plane. We're calling it Equal Skies." Dominique approached them, curious and touched by their initiative. "That's remarkable. What do you hope to accomplish?" "We're going to document every discriminatory incident we experience or witness on any airline," explained the woman who introduced herself as Karen Mitchell. "We're creating an app where travelers can report incidents in real time with documentation, and we're establishing a legal defense fund," added another passenger, an older man who identified himself as Dr. Luis Ortiz, "to support passengers who face discrimination and challenge airline policies that enable it." What Dominique was witnessing was extraordinary, the spontaneous formation of a movement catalyzed by one incident but fueled by countless shared experiences. These passengers weren't just providing testimony, they were organizing for lasting change. "This is exactly what's needed," Dominique acknowledged. "Regulatory reform is important, but sustained public attention and advocacy are essential to ensure lasting change." As federal investigators continued their work, the impromptu coalition aboard Flight 1942 had accomplished something remarkable, transforming a single incident of discrimination into a comprehensive body of evidence documenting what appeared to be years of inequitable treatment. Their collective action had created a foundation for potential reforms that might never have been possible through individual complaints. For Dominique Reynolds, watching this organic collaboration unfold, there was a profound sense of witnessing something historic. What had begun as her personal experience of injustice had catalyzed a broader movement for accountability, one that extended far beyond her official authority as FAA director. In the last row of North Star Flight 1842, once intended as a place of diminishment, seeds of transformation had taken root. The journey that had begun with discrimination was now proceeding toward justice, propelled not by one woman's power, but by a collective determination to ensure that no passenger would ever again be judged by their appearance rather than their ticket. As federal investigators continued gathering evidence aboard Flight 1842, a parallel investigation was unfolding in North Star's Operations Center at O'Hare. FAA technical specialists had secured the airline's booking and operations databases, while DOT civil rights officers reviewed years of passenger complaints that had previously been dismissed or settled privately. In Conference Room B, designated as the command center for the federal investigation, Dominique Reynolds reviewed preliminary findings with her team. Digital displays showed data analyses, email chains, and system screenshots, all painting a disturbing picture of North Star's practices. "This goes well beyond what we initially suspected," said Investigator Martinez, directing Dominique's attention to a complex flowchart. "The Blue Sky Protocol isn't just an informal practice. It's a sophisticated algorithm integrated throughout their entire operations system." Dominique studied the diagram carefully. "Explain how it functions." "It starts at booking," Martinez detailed. "Their system assigns a passenger value score based on multiple factors, some legitimate like frequent flyer status and fare paid, but others deeply problematic, including passengers' names, home zip codes, and even credit scores, all proxies that correlate strongly with race." "And once these scores are assigned," Dominique prompted, "they cascade through every aspect of the passenger experience," Martinez continued. "Seat assignments upgrade priority service levels, even how complaints are handled. Lower-scored passengers are routinely placed in less desirable locations, regardless of when they booked or their official status level." Jeffrey Davis, the IT security consultant from Flight 1842, who had been invited to observe the technical investigation due to his expertise, pointed to another screen. "The genius, or rather the insidiousness of the system, is its plausible deniability. They never explicitly code for race, but the correlations are unmistakable when you analyze the outcomes." Dominique's expression remained professionally neutral, though her eyes reflected her growing concern. "And the connection to safety protocols," Martinez switched to another display showing maintenance records. "This is where it becomes potentially criminal. Route categorization as premium versus standard correlates almost perfectly with demographic data of the cities served. Premium routes receive priority maintenance, more conservative safety margins, and newer aircraft, while standard routes operate at minimum required safety levels," Dominique concluded. "Exactly," Martinez confirmed. "Nothing that violates absolute minimum standards, but a clear pattern of providing enhanced safety margins to routes serving predominantly white, affluent communities." Inside, Dominique felt a cold anger building, not just at the discrimination which she had personally experienced, but at the casual endangerment of passengers based on their demographic profiles. As a regulator responsible for aviation safety, this revelation struck at the core of her professional mission. She was about to respond when her phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Amara Mom. "We've completed our analysis of the 2 September 83 passenger complaints. 91% of downgrade incidents involved passengers of color. The pattern is statistically impossible to attribute to chance." "Sharing data now." Dominique nodded at the confirmation of what they were already uncovering. Her daughter and the law student team had provided valuable independent verification. We have enough evidence to proceed with formal enforcement actions, she told Martinez. I want to prepare emergency orders requiring immediate corrective actions. The conference room door opened, and Victoria Ramirez Northstar's chief legal officer entered alongside a woman Dominique recognized as Lucia Hernandez, the airline's newly appointed interim CEO. Director Reynolds Hernandez began her tone respectful but direct. I understand you're conducting a thorough investigation, and Northstar pledges complete cooperation. However, I feel it's important that I provide some context for what you're seeing. Dominique regarded her steadily. I'm listening, Ms. Hernandez. The systems being examined were implemented under William Parker's leadership, Hernandez explained. Many of us in operations raised concerns about potential discriminatory impacts, but those concerns were consistently dismissed as unnecessary social considerations that distracted from market-driven business decisions. You're distancing yourself and the company from Parker, Dominique observed. I'm providing factual context, Hernandez countered. The board has authorized me to take immediate corrective action, including suspending all aspects of the Blue Sky Protocol and initiating an independent third-party audit of our operations. Victoria Ramirez added, We're also prepared to settle any legitimate claims resulting from these practices and to work with regulatory authorities on appropriate remedial measures. That's commendable, Dominique acknowledged, but it doesn't address the fundamental issues that allowed these practices to become embedded in your operations, nor does it mitigate potential regulatory violations that may have occurred. Before Hernandez could respond, an FAA data analyst entered the room with a tablet displaying an urgent finding. Director Reynolds, we've discovered something significant in their internal communications. There's an email chain from 3 years ago when these protocols were being implemented. Dominique reviewed the emails, her expression hardening as she read. This is explicit acknowledgement of the demographic impact. Parker writes, and I quote, The optics of cabin composition matter to our premium customers. The algorithm achieves the desired passenger distribution without explicit criteria that could create liability. Hernandez winced visibly. I was not privy to those communications. Perhaps not, Dominique conceded, but they existed within your corporate culture. That's the larger issue we're addressing here. The conversation was interrupted by another analyst entering with fresh findings. Director, we've completed the initial analysis of passenger manifest data across all Northstar routes for the past 6 months. The correlation between passenger placement and racial demographics is statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.01. This could not have occurred by chance. For several moments, the room was silent as the implications settled. This was no longer about individual actions or isolated incidents. It was evidence of a comprehensive, structured approach to discrimination that permeated an entire airline's operations. Victoria Ramirez broke the silence. Director Reynolds, given these findings, what regulatory actions should Northstar anticipate? That will depend on the full investigation, Dominique replied evenly. But at minimum expect significant civil penalties, mandatory oversight, and potential review of your operating certificate. The safety implications alone warrant the most serious response. Lucia Hernandez straightened her posture, seeming to come to a decision. Then let me be proactive. As of this moment, I'm grounding all Northstar flights until we can verify that safety protocols are being applied uniformly across our network. I'm also suspending every executive who had direct involvement in implementing these systems. The declaration was bold, potentially costing the airline millions in immediate losses, but demonstrating a commitment to addressing the issues comprehensively. That's a significant step, Dominique acknowledged. But it still doesn't address the passengers who have been affected by these practices potentially for years. I have a proposal for that as well, Hernandez offered. A passenger equity commission with real authority to review and reform all customer-facing policies. And I'd like to invite Ms. Beatrice Johnson from your flight to serve as its honorary chairperson if she's willing. The suggestion caught Dominique by surprise. "You know about Ms. Johnson?" "Everyone in the industry knows about her by now," Hernandez explained. "Gabriel Morales' video interview with her has gone viral. Her perspective spanning decades of air travel would be invaluable to meaningful reform." Just then, Dominique's phone buzzed with an urgent notification. She glanced down to see a news alert breaking multiple airlines suspending passenger prioritization systems, following North Star revelations. She looked up, meeting Hernandez's gaze. It appears the impact of this investigation is already extending beyond North Star. 5 other major carriers have just announced they're suspending similar practices. "The industry knows what's coming," Hernandez observed. "They're trying to get ahead of it. Or they're scrambling to cover their tracks," Martinez suggested more cynically. Dominique considered this development. "We'll need to expand our investigation to determine if these patterns exist across the industry. This may be a moment for comprehensive reform rather than isolated enforcement." As they continued discussing the widening implications, Dominique experienced a moment of personal conflict. The professional part of her was focused on the regulatory response required by the evidence. But another part, the woman who had been humiliated in front of an entire aircraft full of passengers, felt a complex mix of vindication and discomfort with how her personal experience had triggered such far-reaching consequences. Is this truly about the principles? Or am I driving this because of what happened to me? She wondered silently, the doubt briefly clouding her certainty. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her father's old friend and fellow Tuskegee Airman Richard Coleman Joseph would be so proud of you today. You're fighting the battle he always hoped someone would. The message struck a deep chord, reminding Dominique that this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about addressing patterns of inequity that had persisted for generations, affecting countless travelers who lacked the position or platform to challenge them effectively. With renewed clarity, she turned back to the investigation team. "Let's proceed methodically. I want comprehensive documentation of every aspect of these practices, with particular focus on safety implications. We need to build a case that's unassailable." Martinez nodded. "We're already securing the necessary evidence. The email records alone provide substantial documentation of intent." "Good," Dominique replied, "because I expect significant resistance once the initial shock wears off. The industry will mobilize its considerable resources to challenge any broad regulatory response." As the meeting continued, a staff member entered with a tablet displaying live news coverage from the terminal. On the screen, Eleanor Foster and other passengers from Flight 1942 were conducting an impromptu press conference, sharing their experiences and observations. "This isn't just about one flight or one airline," Eleanor was saying. "This is about decades of practices that have marginalized certain passengers based on their appearance. What happened to Director Reynolds finally brought it into the open, but it's been happening to countless travelers all along." Beside her, Angela Barnes nodded in agreement. "I've witnessed this pattern for years flying with North Star. The difference today is that someone with authority experienced it firsthand." The camera panned to show dozens of other passengers standing behind them in solidarity, a diverse group united by their shared commitment to addressing the injustice they had witnessed. Dominique watched the broadcast with a mixture of professional focus and personal emotion. What had begun as her individual experience had catalyzed into something much larger, a moment of reckoning not just for one airline, but potentially for commercial aviation as a whole. Director Reynolds' Lucia Hernandez said quietly, drawing her attention back to the immediate situation, "I recognize that no corporate response can undo the harm these practices have caused, but I am committed to ensuring that North Star emerges from this crisis as a model for equity in air travel. I would welcome your guidance in that process." Dominique considered the offer carefully. "Ms. Hernandez, my role as FAA director requires regulatory impartiality. I cannot personally advise North Star on its reforms." However, she gestured toward the screen showing the passenger coalition. It appears you have a group of highly qualified and motivated individuals already willing to help guide that transformation. As the meeting continued, the scope of what was unfolding became increasingly clear. The system that had been exposed went beyond isolated incidents or even company-wide practices. It reflected deeper patterns of discrimination that had been normalized within the industry. Addressing it would require not just corporate penalties or individual accountability, but fundamental structural change. For Dominique Reynolds, who had entered North Star Flight 1842 as just another passenger that morning, the journey had expanded far beyond her personal experience. It had become about using her position to ensure that the discrimination she had faced would serve as a catalyst for lasting reform, a transformation that would benefit countless travelers who had previously endured similar treatment without recourse. The investigation was just beginning, but already its impact was reverberating throughout the aviation industry and beyond. What had started in Seat 4C and continued to the last row was now poised to change how millions of passengers would experience air travel in the future. The terminal at O'Hare International Airport buzzed with unprecedented activity as federal investigators, airline executives, media representatives, and passengers from Flight 1842 converged in an unfolding drama that had captured national attention. 3 hours had passed since the aircraft's arrival, yet the repercussions continued to expand in scope and significance. Dominique Reynolds stood at the center of Conference Room A, now designated as the coordination hub for the multi-agency investigation. Around her, representatives from the FAA Department of Transportation Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department and NTSB worked with focused intensity building what was rapidly becoming one of the most comprehensive investigations in commercial aviation history. Director Reynolds called Senior Investigator Martinez, approaching with a tablet. "We've completed the preliminary analysis of maintenance records across North Star's fleet. The disparity between route categories is even more pronounced than we initially thought." Dominique reviewed the data, her expression grave. "This shows an 83% correlation between route demographics and maintenance prioritization. That's beyond concerning, it's potentially criminal negligence." "The safety implications are significant," Martinez agreed. "While no incidents have been directly linked to these practices yet, the statistical risk increase for passengers on standard routes is approximately 26% compared to premium routes." Dominique handed back the tablet. "Expand the investigation to include all major carriers. I want to know if this is an industry-wide issue or specific to North Star." As Martinez departed to implement the directive, Victoria Ramirez entered the room, her typically composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Director Reynolds William Parker is insisting on speaking with you directly. He's rejected counsel's advice and claims he can explain the context behind the systems you're investigating." Dominique felt a flicker of reluctance. Despite her professional obligation to hear all relevant perspectives, the prospect of facing the man whose policies had led to her humiliation was personally challenging. She took a moment to center herself, remembering that this was not about her feelings, but about her responsibility as FAA director. "Very well," she replied after a moment's consideration. "I'll meet with him, but only with investigators present and on record. This isn't a private conversation." "He's waiting in Conference Room C," Victoria informed her. "Interim CEO Hernandez has also requested to be present." "That's appropriate." Dominique nodded. "Let's proceed." As they moved through the terminal's administrative corridor, they passed a large window overlooking the concourse. Below, an extraordinary scene was unfolding. The passengers from Flight 1842, still largely together as a group, had been joined by travelers from other flights who had heard about the situation. What had begun as a small coalition had expanded into something resembling a movement, with Eleanor Foster and Beatrice Johnson at its center, sharing their experiences with a growing audience. In Conference Room C, William Parker sat alone at the table, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of hasty preparation. When Dominique entered, followed by Lucia Hernandez and 2 federal investigators, He stood abruptly. "Director Reynolds," he began without preamble, "this situation has been grossly mischaracterized. The systems you're investigating were designed to optimize customer experience, not to discriminate." Dominique took a seat across from him, her demeanor professional but unyielding. "Mr. Parker, I've reviewed the email chains in which you explicitly discussed the demographic impacts of these systems. Let's not waste time with narratives that contradict documented evidence." Parker's confident facade faltered momentarily before he regained composure. "Those communications are being taken out of context. The Blue Sky Protocol was about creating appropriate cabin environments for our premium customers who have certain expectations. And those expectations included racial homogeneity." Dominique finished for him, her voice steady. "Your own words, Mr. Parker, in an email dated March 17, 2021. The premium cabin environment must reflect the aesthetic preferences of our highest value customers." "That's not," Parker began. "You continued," Dominique pressed, consulting her notes. "The algorithm achieves the desired passenger distribution without explicit criteria that could create liability. That appears to acknowledge both the intent and the deliberate obfuscation of that intent." Parker glanced at Victoria Ramirez, who remained expressionless, offering no assistance. Lucia Hernandez sat with her arms folded, physically distancing herself from her predecessor. "What exactly do you want?" Director Reynolds Parker finally asked, his tone shifting from defensive to calculating. "North Star is a valuable transportation asset. Grounding our fleet or imposing excessive penalties doesn't serve the public interest." "What I want, Mr. Parker, is irrelevant," Dominique replied evenly. "What matters are the federal aviation regulations and civil rights laws that appear to have been violated under your leadership. The consequences will follow established regulatory and legal protocols." Parker leaned forward, his composure slipping further. "Let's be honest here. This is personal for you. You experienced one uncomfortable incident on one flight, and now you're using your position to dismantle an entire airline." The accusation struck a nerve. It was the same doubt Dominique had wrestled with internally, whether her personal experience was unduly influencing her professional judgment. But hearing it from Parker, clearly as a tactical move, crystallized something for her. "Mr. Parker," she replied, her voice taking on a new edge. "What I experienced this morning was not simply uncomfortable, it was discriminatory. But you're mistaken if you think this investigation is driven by personal vindication. Had I received reports of these practices without experiencing them firsthand, I would have pursued them with equal vigor." She gestured to the documentation spread across the table. "The evidence speaks for itself. What we've uncovered is a structured approach to passenger discrimination that appears to extend to safety practices. That's not a personal grievance. It's a serious regulatory concern." Parker's expression hardened, a flash of anger breaking through his professional veneer. "You know what the real problem is, Reynolds? You're overreaching. The FAA should stick to safety oversight, not social engineering. These reforms you're pushing both now and in your broader agenda are going to cripple this industry financially." "Safety and equity are not separate issues," Mr. Parker, Dominique countered. "When maintenance resources are allocated based on route demographics rather than objective criteria, that's not just discrimination, it's a safety hazard, and it falls squarely within the FAA's regulatory mandate." The tension in the room had become palpable. Parker, sensing he was losing ground, changed tactics. "You realize what you're doing, don't you? If you push this too far, you'll face significant opposition. There are powerful interests that will resist these changes both in the industry and in Washington." The implied threat hung in the air for a moment before Dominique responded. "Mr. Parker, if you're suggesting that political or industry pressure will deter this investigation, you've fundamentally misunderstood my commitment to the regulatory responsibilities of my position. But more importantly, you've failed to recognize that this moment has already moved beyond your control or mine." She gestured toward the window where they could see the growing crowd of passengers and observers below. What's happening right now isn't just about regulatory action. It's about public recognition of patterns that have been normalized for too long. That momentum won't be easily stopped regardless of what lobbying efforts you might mobilize. Parker seemed about to respond when his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted from confrontational to resigned. "It seems you're right about the momentum," he said, showing the screen to Victoria Ramirez. "The Congressional Transportation Committee is calling an emergency hearing for next week. They're requesting my testimony and yours, Director Reynolds." "I'll be there," Dominique replied without hesitation, "with complete documentation of our findings." Parker stood slowly, the fight seemingly drained from him. "You know, Reynolds, I've been in this industry for 32 years. I've seen regulations come and go, investigations rise and fall. This feels different." "It is different," Dominique confirmed. "Because it's not just about policies or penalties. It's about acknowledging a fundamental truth that air travel as a vital public service operating under federal authority must provide equal treatment to all passengers regardless of their appearance." As Parker gathered his papers preparing to leave Lucia, Hernandez spoke for the first time during the confrontation. "William, for what it's worth, I think you should cooperate fully with the investigation. Not just for the company's sake, but because it's the right thing to do." Parker paused, regarding his successor with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. "Maybe you're right, Lucia, but I built this airline on certain assumptions about what our premium customers wanted. Changing those assumptions means rebuilding everything." "Then perhaps it needs rebuilding," she replied simply. After Parker had departed, escorted by North Star security to avoid the media gathered in the terminal, Dominique turned to Hernandez. "Your predecessor raises a valid point about industry resistance. The changes indicated by this investigation will face significant opposition." "I know," Hernandez acknowledged, "but the alternative is continuing patterns that are not just morally wrong, but potentially dangerous. As interim CEO, I'd rather lead transformation than defend the indefensible." As they left the conference room, they encountered Beatrice Johnson, who had been brought up from the concourse by an FAA staff member. The elderly woman carried herself with quiet dignity, her expression serene despite the chaotic activity surrounding her. Miss Johnson Dominique greeted her warmly. "I understand North Star has invited you to chair their new Passenger Equity Commission." Beatrice smiled. "They have, though I haven't given them my answer yet. I wanted to speak with you first." "My role requires regulatory neutrality," Dominique explained. "I can't formally advise you on this decision." "I'm not asking for regulatory advice, Director Reynolds," Beatrice replied with gentle wisdom. "I'm asking what Dominique thinks the woman who sat beside me in the last row and recognized something I've seen for 67 years. The distinction touched Dominique deeply. Since the moment her identity had been revealed aboard Flight 1842, she had been operating primarily in her official capacity. Beatrice was one of the few people who had known her first as simply Dominique, a fellow traveler facing discrimination with dignity. "Speaking personally, Ms. Johnson," she replied carefully, "I believe your experience and perspective would be invaluable to any meaningful reform effort. But I also understand if you choose not to take on that burden. You've already carried enough." Beatrice considered this for a moment before responding. "My father was denied the right to fly commercial planes after serving his country in World War II. He died never having experienced fair treatment in air travel. If I can help ensure that my grandchildren won't face the same indignities, that's not a burden, it's a privilege." Dominique nodded, touched by the parallel to her own father's story. "Then I think you have your answer." As they walked together toward the main terminal where the growing assembly of passengers and media awaited, Dominique felt a renewed sense of clarity about the path forward. What had begun with her personal experience of discrimination had expanded into something far larger, yet the personal dimension remained important, not as a driver of regulatory action, but as a reminder of the human impact behind the statistics and policies. The confrontation with Parker had confirmed what she already knew, that meaningful change would face significant resistance from entrenched interests. But it had also revealed something more hopeful, that the momentum for reform had already grown beyond what any single corporation or lobbying effort could contain. As they approached the gathered crowd, cameras turned toward them, and a hush fell over the terminal. This was no longer just a regulatory matter, it had become a public reckoning that demanded transparency. For Dominique Reynolds, the journey that had begun in Seat 4C and continued to the last row was now moving toward a new destination, one that promised not just individual accountability, but structural reform that would benefit millions of travelers for years to come. The scene at O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3 had evolved into something unprecedented in commercial aviation history. What had begun as a single act of discrimination aboard Flight 1942 had catalyzed a remarkable convergence of federal authorities, corporate executives, and ordinary passengers united in confronting long-standing patterns of inequality in air travel. Director Reynolds called a CNN reporter as Dominique moved through the concourse with Lucia Hernandez and federal investigators. Is the FAA considering revoking North Star's operating certificate? Before Dominique could respond, another journalist pressed forward. Ms. Hernandez, will North Star be filing for bankruptcy protection given the fleet grounding and potential penalties? Dominique raised a hand, silencing the barrage of questions. We'll be holding a formal press conference in 30 minutes. Until then, our focus remains on the investigation and addressing the immediate concerns of affected passengers. As they proceeded toward the designated briefing area, Gabriel Morales approached, still documenting the unfolding events. Director Reynolds, your decision to move this entire process into the public terminal rather than behind closed doors in corporate offices seems deliberate. Can you speak to that choice? This question, more insightful than the others, gave Dominique pause. Mr. Morales' transparency is essential in addressing issues that have been hidden by design for too long. The passengers who experience this discrimination deserve to witness the accountability process firsthand. Near the international arrivals area, a space had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Digital screens displayed flight information, investigation updates, and social media trends where #LastRowJustice and #ReynoldsReform were now trending nationally. Eleanor Foster approached with a tablet. Director, we've organized the passenger testimonials by category and date. The patterns are remarkably consistent across years and routes. Thank you, Ms. Foster, Dominique acknowledged. Your leadership in coordinating these accounts has been invaluable. At that moment, William Parker reappeared, having evaded his security escort. His earlier defensive demeanor had hardened into something more confrontational. Behind him followed several men in expensive suits, industry lobbyists who had apparently been summoned for emergency support. Director Reynolds. He called loudly enough for nearby journalists to hear. This public spectacle is unprofessional and potentially damaging to an essential transportation provider. These matters should be addressed through proper regulatory channels, not trial by media. A hush fell over the immediate area as all eyes turned to Dominique. The confrontation that many had been anticipating had finally materialized, with Parker clearly attempting to regain control of the narrative. Dominique felt a familiar internal conflict, the professional regulator versus the woman who had been personally discriminated against. She took a deep breath, centering herself before responding. Mr. Parker, she replied, her voice calm, but carrying clearly, North Star Airways operates under federal authority, using public infrastructure and serving the American public. The proper channel for addressing discrimination that affects thousands of travelers is precisely this: transparent, accountable, and accessible to those who have been impacted. Parker's attorneys exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with their client's public approach. One whispered urgently in his ear, but he brushed the advice aside. This investigation has been compromised by your personal bias, Parker insisted, raising his voice to ensure the gathering crowd could hear. You experienced what you perceived as unfair treatment, and are now leveraging your position for Mr. Parker." Dominique interrupted her voice, remaining measured but carrying undeniable authority. "Let me be absolutely clear. When I boarded Flight 1942 this morning, I did so as a private citizen using a personal frequent flyer account. I did not identify myself as FAA director because I wanted to experience your airline as ordinary passengers do. What I encountered, and what the evidence increasingly confirms, is a structured approach to discrimination that affects countless travelers daily." She gestured to the gathered passengers from Flight 1942 and others who had joined them. These individuals have been sharing similar experiences that long predate today's events. This isn't about me or my position. It's about a pattern of practices that violates both aviation regulations and civil rights laws. Parker opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, an unexpected figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Amara Reynolds, Dominique's daughter, who had apparently flown to Chicago as soon as the story broke. "Mr. Parker," Amara said, her voice clear and confident. "I've spent the past 3 hours coordinating a team of law students analyzing Northstar's passenger complaint data. We've documented 783 formal complaints about discriminatory treatment over the past 3 years, 91% of which were filed by passengers of color. Your company dismissed 87% of these without investigation." Parker seemed momentarily taken aback by this new voice and information. "And who exactly are you?" Amara Reynolds, second-year law student at Howard University, focusing on transportation equity law. She replied without hesitation. "And as a private citizen concerned about these patterns, I've initiated the framework for a class action lawsuit representing affected passengers." The gathered media instantly redirected their attention to this unexpected development, cameras swiveling toward Amara. Dominique felt a surge of maternal pride mixed with professional concern. She hadn't expected her daughter to insert herself so directly into the situation, yet Amara's initiative perfectly embodied the principles of advocacy Dominique had always encouraged. Beatrice Johnson stepped forward, positioning herself beside Amara. "Young man," she addressed Parker directly, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I was refused a seat at the front of a bus in 1955. I was refused service at a lunch counter in 1960. I was refused a first-class airline seat despite having a valid ticket in 1962. And today, in 2025, I watched it happen again to Director Reynolds. The only difference is that today, finally, someone with the authority to change things experienced it firsthand." Parker seemed momentarily taken aback by the elderly woman's directness. Before he could recover, Angela Barnes joined them. As corporate counsel for multiple Fortune 500 companies, she said, addressing Parker professionally, "I would strongly advise against continuing this public confrontation. The evidence being gathered, which I've reviewed as a voluntary advisor to the Passenger Coalition, appears to establish clear patterns of discriminatory practices that would be difficult to defend in either regulatory proceedings or civil litigation." Parker's own attorneys nodded in reluctant agreement, one of them tugging at his sleeve in an attempt to end the increasingly disadvantageous exchange. Lucia Hernandez, who had been observing the confrontation with evident discomfort, finally stepped forward. "William, this isn't helping Northstar or its employees. The board has made its decision. The evidence speaks for itself. It's time to step back and let the investigation proceed properly." For a moment, Parker seemed poised to continue his protest. Then, perhaps finally recognizing the futility of his position, he nodded curtly to his attorneys and allowed them to lead him away from the gathering. As he departed, a spontaneous murmur of approval rippled through the assembled passengers and onlookers. It wasn't celebration so much as collective relief, a shared acknowledgement that accountability was finally taking precedence over corporate protection. Dominique turned to address the broader group. "In 30 minutes, we'll hold a formal briefing in Conference Room D, which has been opened to accommodate media and interested parties. Federal investigators will provide a preliminary overview of findings, and North Star leadership will outline immediate corrective actions. She glanced at her watch. Until then, I need to confer with the investigation team to ensure we're presenting accurate and comprehensive information. As the crowd began to disperse, Dominique found herself face to face with her daughter. "Amara," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Did you really think I wouldn't come?" Amara replied. "When I saw that video of you being escorted to the last row, I knew I needed to be here, not just as your daughter, but as someone committed to the same principles you've always taught me." The class action framework Dominique asked both impressed and concerned about the potential appearance of coordination between regulatory action and private litigation. "Completely independent," Amara assured her, understanding the concern immediately. "I'm working with Professor Martinez at Howard Law. We've been establishing the foundations for transportation equity cases for months. This just provided a clear example of the patterns we've been researching." Dominique nodded, relieved by her daughter's professional awareness. "You were impressive back there. Your father would be proud." "Grandpa, too," Amara added softly. "I'm carrying his legacy just as much as you are." As they moved toward the conference area, they were joined by Beatrice Johnson and Eleanor Foster, who had emerged as the unofficial leaders of what was rapidly becoming known on social media as the Last Row movement. "Your daughter is remarkable," Beatrice told Dominique. "She's been coordinating with passengers since the moment news broke, establishing a database for our experiences that will be invaluable for both regulatory action and civil litigation." "The apple doesn't fall far," Eleanor observed with a smile. Dominique nodded in agreement, feeling a profound sense of connection between generations from her father's struggles as a Tuskegee airman, denied commercial flying opportunities, to her own experiences navigating discrimination throughout her career, to Amara's commitment to continuing the fight through legal advocacy. As they reached the conference area where federal officials were preparing presentation materials and coordinating with North Star representatives, Dominique took a moment to observe the scene. Through the glass walls, she could see the gathered media setting up cameras and microphones, while passengers from Flight 1942 and other North Star flights continued to arrive, drawn by social media alerts about the upcoming briefing. What had begun as a personal experience of discrimination had evolved into something far larger, a catalyst for addressing patterns that had persisted for decades, normalized to the point of invisibility for those not directly affected. Gabriel Morales approached his camera, still recording. "Director Reynolds, one final question before the formal briefing. Your decision to stay in the last row rather than demand your business class seat back has become a powerful symbol. Was that a deliberate choice?" Dominique considered the question carefully. "In that moment, Mr. Morales, I recognized that returning to business class would address only my individual situation. Remaining in the last row allowed me to observe patterns affecting all passengers and gather testimony that might otherwise have been missed. Sometimes the view from the back reveals truths that aren't visible from the front." It was a perspective her father had often shared, that his experiences of discrimination, painful as they were, had given him insights that privileged individuals rarely obtained. In choosing to remain in the last row rather than assert her authority for personal benefit, Dominique had honored his example and unintentionally created a powerful symbol that was resonating far beyond the confines of Flight 1842. As she prepared for the formal briefing, Dominique felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her, not just as FAA director charged with regulatory oversight, but as someone uniquely positioned to ensure that this moment of reckoning would lead to lasting change rather than temporary headlines. The airport showdown had revealed not just the depth of the problems within North Star Airways, but the broader hunger for accountability and change that had resonated with thousands of travelers nationwide. The journey that had begun in Seat 4C and continued to the last row was now poised to reshape how millions would experience air travel in the years to come. 6 weeks after the events aboard Flight 1942, Dominique Reynolds stood at a podium in the Department of Transportation's Conference Center, addressing a room filled with aviation industry executives, civil rights leaders, passenger advocates, and media representatives. Behind her, a screen displayed the newly announced Reynolds Protocols for Equitable Air Travel, comprehensive federal guidelines designed to eliminate discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. Today marks not the conclusion, but rather the commencement of a fundamental transformation in how air travel serves all Americans. Dominique began her voice carrying the authority that had become familiar to millions through her handling of the North Star investigation. The patterns revealed 6 weeks ago were not isolated to one airline or one incident. They reflected broader structural issues that have persisted throughout the industry, often invisible to those not directly affected. In the front row, Beatrice Johnson sat alongside Eleanor Foster and other key members of what had become known as the 1842 Coalition, the passengers whose coordinated testimonies had provided crucial evidence for the federal investigation. Beside them, Sofia Rodriguez and other whistleblowers from various airlines watched attentively, their courage in coming forward having expanded the investigation far beyond North Star. The Reynolds Protocols establish clear standards for equitable treatment across all aspects of air travel. Dominique continued. From transparent booking algorithms to balanced allocation of maintenance resources across all routes. From consistent service standards regardless of passenger demographics to accountable complaint resolution procedures. These measures are not suggestions, they are regulatory requirements that will be actively monitored and enforced. From her position at the back of the room, Lucia Hernandez observed the proceedings with professional interest. Under her leadership, North Star Airways had undergone a remarkable transformation. While the airline had faced substantial penalties, $412 million in federal fines, plus settlements with affected passengers, it had also emerged as an unlikely leader in implementing reforms often exceeding federal requirements. The Passenger Equity Commission, initially established at North Star and now expanded to include representatives from all major carriers, has created an unprecedented framework for continuous improvement, Dominique acknowledged. I particularly want to recognize the leadership of Beatrice Johnson, whose lifetime of experiences has informed many of the most significant reforms. Beatrice, dignified in a royal blue suit, nodded in acknowledgement as applause filled the room. At 87, she had become an unexpected icon of the movement for transportation equity, her photograph appearing on the cover of Time magazine under the headline, "From Back of the Plane to the Forefront of Change." Industry-wide implementation of these protocols will begin immediately, Dominique announced, with full compliance required within 180 days. The FAA, in coordination with the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division, will conduct regular audits to verify adherence to these standards. As Dominique outlined the specific requirements, industry executives exchanged glances, recognizing the comprehensive nature of the reforms. What had begun as an investigation of one airline had expanded to encompass the entire commercial aviation sector, with implications that would reshape everything from booking systems to crew training to maintenance priorities. These changes may appear challenging to implement, Dominique acknowledged, addressing the industry concerns directly. However, our analysis demonstrates that equitable treatment is not merely ethically imperative but economically advantageous. North Star Airways, which has already implemented many of these reforms, has reported a 23% increase in customer satisfaction scores and an 18% reduction in service-related complaints across all demographics. Lucia Hernandez nodded in confirmation from her position at the back of the room. What had initially seemed like a potential death blow to the airline had somewhat surprisingly created an opportunity for North Star to reinvent itself as an industry leader in equitable service. After concluding her formal remarks, Dominique opened the floor for questions. A reporter from the Washington Post was first to speak. Director Reynolds' critics have suggested that these reforms were driven by your personal experience rather than objective regulatory considerations. How do you respond? The question touched on the doubt that had troubled Dominique in the early days of the investigation. Was she allowing her personal experience to unduly influence her professional judgment? Had her own humiliation aboard Flight 1842 colored her perspective on the appropriate regulatory response? She took a moment to formulate her answer, wanting to be both honest and precise. My personal experience aboard Flight 1842 provided first-hand insight into practices that thousands of passengers had reported for years, she began. However, the Reynolds protocols are based on comprehensive data analysis of passenger experiences across multiple airlines over the past decade. They address patterns that long predated my involvement and would exist regardless of my personal experience. She paused before continuing. That said, I would be disingenuous if I claimed that witnessing discrimination directly didn't deepen my understanding of its impact. Sometimes regulators need to experience the systems they oversee from the perspective of ordinary users. The last row provided a vantage point that illuminated realities that might otherwise have remained obscured. Gabriel Morales, whose documentation of the original incident had launched him into prominence as a transportation equity journalist, raised his hand. Director, the Passenger Equity Commission has become a model for other industries beyond aviation. Could you speak to the broader implications of this approach? The Commission's effectiveness lies in its composition, Dominique explained. By bringing together industry professionals, regulatory experts, and most importantly, passengers with diverse lived experiences, it creates solutions that address both operational realities and human impacts. This model could indeed prove valuable across transportation sectors and beyond. Near the middle of the room, Amara Reynolds, who had transitioned from volunteer coordinator to official consultant for the DOT's Civil Rights Division, posed a question that many had been considering. Director Reynolds, while these reforms address future practices, what about accountability for past discrimination? Thousands of passengers experienced these patterns before they were formally acknowledged. It was a delicate question that touched on both legal and ethical considerations. Dominique answered thoughtfully. The settlement framework established with North Star provides a template for addressing historical harms. While financial compensation cannot fully remediate discriminatory experiences, it represents meaningful acknowledgement and consequence. Beyond individual airlines, we're working with Congress on legislation that would create a dedicated fund for passengers affected by documented patterns of discrimination across the industry. William Parker, conspicuously absent from the proceedings, had resigned his position permanently following congressional hearings, where his testimony had been widely criticized as evasive and unrepentant. Reports indicated he had retreated to his estate in Vermont, refusing further media contact. In contrast, Thomas Bennett and Laura Wilson, the flight attendants who had removed Dominique from her business class seat, had taken unexpected paths. After initially defending their actions as compliance with company policy, both had ultimately acknowledged their role in perpetuating discriminatory practices. Thomas had left the airline industry entirely, but Laura had joined North Star's Internal Reform Committee, providing valuable insights on crew training and policy implementation. As the briefing concluded, attendees moved to a reception area where implementation workshops were scheduled to begin. Dominique found herself approached by Beatrice Johnson, who had become both colleague and friend through their shared work over the past weeks. "You know," Beatrice said quietly, "when I was moved to the back of that bus in 1955, I never imagined I'd live to see a day when my experiences would help shape federal policy." There's a certain poetry to it all. Dominique nodded. "Your perspective has been invaluable, Ms. Johnson. These reforms are stronger and more comprehensive because they're informed by experiences spanning decades." And now Beatrice continued with a knowing smile, "You're scheduled to fly back to Washington this evening on a North Star flight, I understand?" "Indeed," Dominique confirmed. "Their new policies will get their first official evaluation." "And where are you sitting?" Beatrice inquired, eyes twinkling. "Last row, middle seat," Dominique replied with a smile of her own. "By choice this time. It seems fitting somehow." Beatrice nodded approvingly. The symbolism won't be lost on anyone. From a place of discrimination to a position of transformation. Across the room, Eleanor Foster was engaged in animated conversation with airline executives, her 30 years of North Star customer experience providing valuable insights for implementation strategies. Sofia Rodriguez, now leading crew training programs focused on equitable service, demonstrated interactive scenarios for identifying and addressing unconscious bias. For Dominique Reynolds, observing this collaboration between individuals who 6 weeks earlier had been on opposite sides of a profound divide, the scene represented the most meaningful outcome of all. Beyond the regulatory changes, beyond the corporate penalties, beyond the personal vindication, the lasting transformation would come through this. The recognition that air travel, like all essential services, could only achieve its highest purpose when it served all passengers with equal dignity and care. As she prepared to depart for her flight, Dominique found herself pulled aside by Secretary Williams. The president called, he informed her. He's nominating you for Transportation Secretary when Johnston retires next month. The news caught Dominique by surprise. That's unexpected. Is it? Williams replied. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the department needs. The ability to translate personal insight into structural reform, the courage to challenge entrenched patterns, the vision to see beyond immediate remedies to lasting transformation. Dominique felt momentarily overwhelmed by the prospect. I'll need to consider it carefully. Of course, Williams nodded. But consider this too, from the last row of Flight 1942 to the highest transportation position in the country. That's a journey that would send a powerful message about the direction of American transportation policy. As she reflected on this unexpected development, Dominique thought of her father, of the barriers he had faced, and the dreams he had deferred. She thought of her daughter carrying forward the family's commitment to equity and justice through her legal work. And she thought of Beatrice Johnson and the countless other travelers whose experiences had long gone unacknowledged by those with the power to effect change. The prospect of expanding her influence beyond aviation to all transportation sectors was both daunting and compelling. The patterns revealed in the North Star investigation likely existed across modes of travel, often normalized to the point of invisibility except to those directly affected. As she walked through the terminal toward her departing flight, Dominique passed ordinary travelers going about their journeys, families reuniting, business people rushing to connections, elderly passengers being assisted by airport staff. Each of them deserved the assurance that their travel experience would be determined by their ticket, not their appearance. That recognition, simple yet profound, had driven her throughout the investigation and the subsequent reforms. It would guide her consideration of the president's offer as well. Not personal ambition, but the opportunity to ensure that transportation in all its forms served all Americans with equal dignity. The last row, once a place of humiliation, had indeed become a vantage point for transformation, not just for one airline or one passenger, but potentially for the entire American transportation system. 1 year after the events of Flight 1842, the transformed landscape of commercial aviation was evident to travelers nationwide. The changes manifested not just in corporate policies or regulatory frameworks, but in the everyday experiences of passengers across all demographics. At Chicago O'Hare International Airport Terminal 3 now housed the Beatrice Johnson Center for Transportation Equity, a glass-walled space where travelers could learn about the history of discrimination in transportation access resources, about their rights, and report concerns directly to federal regulators. The center, jointly funded by major airlines and the Department of Transportation, served as both educational resource and accountability mechanism. Dominique Reynolds, recently confirmed as Transportation Secretary after her successful tenure as FAA Director, moved through the busy terminal observing the implementation of the protocols that now bore her name. She was traveling not as a government official today, but as keynote speaker for the National Transportation Equity Conference being held in Chicago, the first gathering of its kind, bringing together representatives from airlines, regulatory agencies, passenger advocacy groups, and civil rights organizations. Secretary Reynolds called a familiar voice. Dominique turned to see Gabriel Morales approaching professional camera, now replaced by conference credentials. Or should I say, Madam Secretary now? Dominique smiled. Either is accurate, though I'm still adjusting to the new title. Your confirmation received unprecedented bipartisan support, Gabriel noted. Not surprising given the impact of the Reynolds protocols. Preliminary data shows a 76% reduction in discrimination complaints across all carriers, with Northstar leading at 94%. The credit belongs to the implementation teams Dominique acknowledged, particularly the passenger advocates who ensured these reforms addressed real experiences rather than theoretical concepts. They walked together toward the conference center, passing gate areas, where digital displays now showed maintenance status, on-time performance, and service metrics for each flight part of the new transparency requirements. Boarding processes had been redesigned with randomized sequence numbers within priority groups, eliminating the subjective elements that had previously allowed discrimination to flourish. Your documentary premieres tonight, correct? Dominique asked. Gabriel nodded. From last row to leadership screens at 7:00 p.m. as part of the conference program. Beatrice Johnson and Eleanor Foster will join me for the panel discussion afterward. I look forward to seeing it, Dominique replied. Though living through those events was quite enough documentation for me personally. As they approached the conference center, Lucia Hernandez emerged from a meeting room engaged in conversation with Sofia Rodriguez, who now served as Northstar's Vice President for Equitable Service Standards. Under Hernandez's leadership, Northstar had not merely survived the crisis, but had transformed it into a remarkable corporate turnaround story. Madam Secretary Hernandez greeted her warmly. Your timing is perfect. We were just reviewing the one-year implementation data across all carriers. The results are extremely encouraging. Sofia Rodriguez, whose whistleblower testimony had been instrumental in the initial investigation, handed Dominique a tablet displaying comprehensive metrics. Passenger satisfaction scores have increased across all demographic categories, with the most significant improvements among groups previously experiencing disparate treatment. Dominique reviewed the data with professional satisfaction. These numbers reflect real changes in passenger experiences. That's the true measure of success. And importantly, Lucia added the financial impacts have been positive rather than detrimental. The operational efficiencies gained through standardized service protocols have offset implementation costs, while improved customer satisfaction has strengthened brand loyalty across all passenger segments. This financial validation had been crucial in gaining industry-wide acceptance of the reforms. What many executives had initially viewed as costly regulatory impositions had proven to enhance both customer experience and bottom-line results, a compelling combination that had accelerated adoption beyond regulatory requirements. As they continued toward the main conference hall, they passed a wall displaying photographs of key figures in the movement that had emerged from Flight 1942. Beatrice Johnson's dignified portrait held central position, flanked by images of Eleanor Foster, Angela Barnes, and other members of the original passenger coalition. Beside them, photographs of whistleblowers from various airlines. Sofia Rodriguez, prominent among them, represented the industry professionals who had risked careers to expose discriminatory practices. The exhibit opened yesterday, Lucia explained. It traces the evolution from individual incident to industry-wide transformation. And importantly, Sofia added, it connects current reforms to historical context. Beatrice Johnson's experiences spanning 7 decades provide powerful perspective on both progress made and challenges remaining. The main conference hall was filling with attendees when they arrived. At the entrance, Dominique was surprised to encounter a familiar face, Thomas Bennett, the flight attendant whose discriminatory actions had triggered the events of Flight 1942. Madam Secretary, he said, clearly uncomfortable but determined. I wasn't sure if you'd be attending today. Mr. Bennett, Dominique acknowledged with professional courtesy. I'm delivering the keynote address. I've been invited to participate in a panel discussion on crew retraining programs, he explained. After completing the comprehensive equity education program, I've been working with North Star's implementation team to help other crew members understand the impacts of discriminatory practices. It was an unexpected development, the former enforcer of discriminatory policies now engaged in dismantling them. Dominique's expression reflected her surprise. It's been educational, Thomas continued. Working directly with passengers affected by policies I once implemented has fundamentally changed my perspective. I can't undo my actions that day, but I can help ensure they're never repeated. Dominique nodded thoughtfully. That's perhaps the most meaningful outcome possible. Genuine understanding leading to active change. As they parted ways, Dominique reflected on the complex human dimensions of the transformation. Beyond regulations and corporate policies, beyond metrics and protocols, the most significant changes were occurring within individuals, both those who had experienced discrimination and those who had perpetuated it. The conference program began with a video montage tracing the events that had catalyzed the industry-wide reforms. Footage from Gabriel's original recording aboard Flight 1942 transitioned to scenes of the passenger coalition forming at O'Hare, the federal investigation expanding to multiple carriers, congressional hearings featuring Beatrice Johnson's powerful testimony, and finally the implementation of the Reynolds protocols across the industry. When Dominique took the stage for her keynote address, she surveyed the diverse audience with profound appreciation for the collective journey that had brought them to this moment. 1 year ago, she began discrimination that had been normalized for decades, was exposed through a single incident that resonated with thousands of similar experiences. Today, we gather not to celebrate completion, but to acknowledge progress and recommit to the ongoing work of transformation. From her seat in the front row, Beatrice Johnson nodded in agreement, her expression reflecting both satisfaction with achievements made and recognition of challenges still ahead. The Reynolds protocols are not merely regulatory requirements, Dominique continued. They represent a fundamental reimagining of how essential services should operate in a diverse society, with transparency, accountability, and equal dignity for all users, regardless of their appearance or background. As she spoke, Dominique noticed William Parker seated near the back of the hall. The former North Star CEO had maintained a low profile since his resignation, but his presence at the conference suggested an interest in the industry's evolution. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, not in confrontation, but in mutual recognition of how profoundly the landscape had changed. The metrics we've seen today are encouraging, Dominique acknowledged, but numbers alone cannot capture the full significance of this transformation. The true measure lies in individual experiences in passengers who no longer wonder if their appearance will determine their treatment in crew members who operate within systems designed for equity rather than exclusion, and in an industry that has begun to acknowledge its historical shortcomings while actively working toward a more inclusive future. As she continued her address, Dominique's phone vibrated quietly in her pocket with a notification. She would check it later, but she already knew what it would be, a reminder that her daughter Amara was scheduled to present her research on transportation equity at Howard University Law School later that week. The family legacy of confronting discrimination and working toward more equitable systems continued into a new generation. The transformation we've witnessed in air travel provides a model for other transportation sectors, Dominique told the audience. Similar patterns have been documented in rail service rideshare platforms and maritime transportation. As Secretary, I am committed to extending these principles of transparency, accountability, and equal dignity across all modes of travel. The response was enthusiastic applause, particularly from representatives of other transportation industries who had come to learn from the aviation sector's experience. As she concluded her address, Dominique recalled the words Beatrice Johnson had spoken to her in the last row of Flight 1942 1 year earlier. Make it count, for all of us who couldn't fight back. Looking out at the assembled leaders now actively implementing reforms that would benefit millions of travelers, Dominique felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that had begun with discrimination had evolved into something powerful and constructive, a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one flight, one airline, or one individual's experience. After the presentation, as attendees moved toward breakout sessions, Dominique found herself momentarily alone, gazing out a window at aircraft taking off and landing in the distance. Each flight now operated under standards that ensured all passengers would experience the same level of service safety and dignity regardless of their appearance. In her pocket, she felt the weight of her father's distinguished Flying Cross, the medal she had carried on Flight 1842 and throughout the transformative year that followed. She had continued to carry it to each significant milestone, a tangible connection to the legacy that had shaped her commitment to equity. "Dad," she thought, "we've made progress. The skies you fought to defend are becoming more accessible to everyone, in the way you always believed they should be." The transformation that had begun in the last row was now reshaping the entire transportation landscape, ensuring that future generations would experience travel with the equal dignity and respect that had too often been denied to those who came before. Arlington National Cemetery stretched before Dominique Reynolds, its rolling green hills dotted with white markers extending toward the horizon. She walked with measured steps along the path she had traveled many times before, carrying a small bouquet of yellow roses, her father's favorite. The autumn air carried a crisp edge leaves beginning their transition to the brilliant colors that had always reminded Colonel Joseph Reynolds of flying over New England in his P-51 Mustang. Dominique found his grave marker exactly where it had always been, yet somehow it felt different today. Colonel Joseph Reynolds, United States Air Force Tuskegee Airman. The simple white stone carried the weight of history, both personal and national. She placed the roses carefully at the base of the marker and stood in silence for a moment, the memories washing over her like gentle waves. Her father in his uniform showing her how to fold paper airplanes, his proud smile at her Stanford graduation, his unwavering belief that the sky belonged to everyone, even when society insisted otherwise. "We did it, Dad," she said softly to the stone. "Not just me, all of us together. The changes you hoped for, the ones you fought for in your own way. They're happening." The breeze stirred the cemetery's trees, a sound like distant applause. "The Reynolds protocols are now standard across the industry," she continued, as if updating him on a project they had planned together. "Airlines that once had two standards of service depending on what passengers looked like now operate with consistent dignity for everyone. Routes that were considered less important because of who they served now receive equal maintenance priority and safety resources." She smiled slightly, remembering her father's practical nature. "And you'll appreciate this, it's actually more efficient. Turns out discrimination wasn't just wrong, it was wasteful. The standardized protocols have improved on-time performance by 14% industry-wide." From a nearby ridge, the faint sounds of another funeral service carried on the wind, the measured cadence of military honors being rendered to another fallen service member. Dominique paused respectfully until the distant ceremony concluded. "Your generation fought battles we can barely comprehend," she reflected. "Flying combat missions while facing discrimination at home. You told me once that you never expected to see real change in your lifetime, that you were planting trees whose shade you might never sit under." She touched the cool stone gently. "I wish you could see the forest that's growing now, Dad. Not just from your seeds, but from all those who kept planting even when the ground seemed too hard to bear fruit." Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket, a reminder of the day's remaining obligations. Amara would be waiting for her at Georgetown Law School, where together they would deliver a guest lecture on transportation equity law to students specializing in civil rights. The course had been Amara's initiative, inspired by the events following Flight 1842 and the legal precedents established in its wake. "I have to go soon," Dominique told her father's marker. Amara is carrying this forward in her own way now, the third generation of our family working to ensure the sky belongs to everyone. She's brilliant, Dad. Fierce and determined just like you were." As she prepared to leave, Dominique removed something from her pocket, her father's distinguished flying cross, which she had carried on Flight 1842 and throughout the transformative year that followed. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight and significance. "I've been carrying this with me for strength," she explained to the silent stone. "But today, I want to leave it with you for a while. It's completed its journey." She carefully placed the medal beside the roses, a glint of bronze against white marble and yellow petals. It seemed right somehow, a symbol returned to its source after fulfilling its purpose in a new generation struggle. "The last row turned out to be the perfect vantage point, Dad," she said softly. "Just like you always told me, sometimes you have to step back to see the whole picture clearly." As Dominique turned to leave, she noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair being guided along a nearby path by a young woman, perhaps his granddaughter. The man wore a Tuskegee Airman cap, similar to the one her father had worn to veterans' events. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared history and purpose that transcended personal acquaintance. The man nodded slightly, and Dominique returned the gesture with profound respect before continuing along her path. These encounters had become more meaningful since the events of Flight 1842 connections with a generation whose experiences had often been minimized or forgotten, but whose courage had laid the groundwork for present progress. Walking back through the cemetery, Dominique felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for what her father had endured, pride in his resilience, gratitude for his legacy, and a renewed commitment to the ongoing work of transformation. The journey that had begun with humiliation aboard Flight 1842 had evolved into something profoundly constructive, not because of her position or authority, but because of the collective determination to address patterns that had been normalized for too long. As she reached her car, Dominique glanced skyward where a commercial airliner traced its path across the blue October sky. She thought of all the passengers aboard, people of every background traveling with the expectation of equal dignity that should always have been their right. Her father had once told her that true progress wasn't measured by grand pronouncements or symbolic gestures, but by the everyday experiences of ordinary people. By that standard, the transformation begun 1 year earlier was achieving something genuine and lasting, not perfect, not complete, but undeniably real. And in that knowledge, Dominique Reynolds found both satisfaction and renewed purpose for the work that still lay ahead. 2 years ago today, a single act of discrimination aboard North Star Flight 1842 catalyzed a transformation that continues to reshape commercial aviation around the world. What began as one woman's experience in the last row has evolved into a movement affecting millions of travelers daily. The screen transitions to footage of diverse passengers boarding aircraft being served with equal attention and care and experiencing air travel with dignity regardless of their appearance. The Reynolds protocols have now been implemented by 103 airlines across 37 countries, establishing new global standards for equitable treatment in air travel. But beyond the statistics and regulations lies a more profound truth when discrimination is confronted with both accountability and vision for change. Transformation becomes possible at every level. The scene shifts to Beatrice Johnson, now 89, seated in a business-class cabin, being greeted respectfully by a flight attendant who once might have questioned her presence there. As Beatrice Johnson, whose experiences span from segregated bus terminals to the chairmanship of the National Passenger Equity Commission, often reminds us, true progress isn't measured by grand pronouncements, but by the everyday dignity of ordinary travelers. The footage transitions to Dominique Reynolds in her role as Transportation Secretary, addressing an international conference on equity in public services. Dominique Reynolds, whose experience in the last row launched this movement, continues to extend these principles across transportation sectors in her new position. Under her leadership, the model established in aviation is now being adapted for rail bus and maritime travel nationwide. The screen splits to show before and after comparisons, crew training sessions focusing on equitable service maintenance resources being allocated equally across all routes, transparent booking systems replacing the algorithmic discrimination that had once been standard practice. The transformation continues because the work is far from complete. Yet, the progress already achieved demonstrates an essential truth speaking up against discrimination, even when it seems futile, even when power appears insurmountable, can indeed change systems that once seemed immovable. The music swells slightly as the camera pans across passengers of all backgrounds, being welcomed aboard flights with equal respect and attention. For everyone who has ever been judged by appearance rather than character, for everyone who has ever been made to feel they don't belong in spaces they have every right to occupy, for everyone who has walked the long journey from the back of the bus to the front of the plane, this story belongs to you. The screen transitions to Gabriel Morales himself speaking directly to camera from an airport terminal where travelers move smoothly through equitably managed systems. If Flight 1842 has taught us anything, it's that dignity isn't a privilege to be earned or a luxury to be purchased. It's a fundamental right that belongs to every person who takes to the skies. And when that right is threatened, speaking truth to power isn't just an option. It's an obligation that falls to all of us who witness injustice. The camera pulls back to reveal Gabriel standing near Gate C-17 at O'Hare International Airport, the very gate where Flight 1842 had docked 2 years earlier. A plaque now commemorates the events that unfolded there, reading, "From this gate, a movement for equity in aviation began. May the journey continue." Thank you for watching this powerful story of transformation. If you've experienced the impact of these changes in your own travels, share your story in the comments below. If you believe in equal dignity for everyone, regardless of appearance or background, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community dedicated to transportation equity worldwide. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family who need to hear this message of hope and positive change. Remember, sometimes the most powerful vantage point isn't at the front where everyone can see you, but at the back where you can truly see everything. Together, we can continue this journey toward more equitable skies for all travelers.